What's up, guys? Welcome to Eclipse Wizardry. We've got something special today. What if Fleur and Daphne both found Harry in cupboard at Privet Drive age 7 and magical Britain watched them fight for soulmate? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The cupboard. The thing about Number 4 Privet Drive was that it looked exactly like every other house on the street, and that was the point. Same cream-painted walls, same neatly edged lawn, same car in the driveway that was newer than the neighbors by just enough to matter. The Dursleys had built a life out of sameness, and they were very good at it. Nobody on Privet Drive knew there was a child living under the stairs. Fleur Delacour had been in England for exactly 4 hours when she ended up on the wrong street. This was not, technically, her fault. She was 9 years old. She had operated for the first time without adult supervision using her mother's emergency portkey backup, a thing she had been told 17 times never to touch, and she had arrived not in Diagon Alley as intended but somewhere in suburban Surrey, which smelled of cut grass and boredom. The portkey had malfunctioned. Or she had. She wasn't entirely sure which, and she wasn't going to admit either possibility out loud. She stood on the pavement at the end of a long, identical-looking street and did what she always did when something went wrong. She tilted her chin up, smoothed the front of her pale blue dress, and assessed the situation like it was something she had chosen. She was going to need a fireplace. Or a telephone, though she'd never used one. Or, her silver blonde hair caught the afternoon light as she turned her head, scanning the street with pale blue eyes that made a passing postman nearly walk into a letterbox. She was going to need someone who could help her, which was usually not difficult. But the pull stopped her before she could take a step. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a smell. It was the kind of feeling that lives behind your sternum, low and insistent, like a word you can't quite remember but know you know. Fleur pressed her hand flat against her chest, frowning. Her grandmère had described this once, in a story Fleur had half dismissed as old Vila mythology, the kind her mother told with one eyebrow slightly raised. There will be a moment, her grandmère had said, when the world tilts. When something that was not there before becomes the most real thing in it. You will know it by how badly you want to walk away and cannot. Fleur looked down the street. A perfectly ordinary street. Perfectly ordinary houses. She started walking. Daphne Greengrass had been planning this trip for 6 weeks. She was 8 years old and she kept a leather-bound journal with brass clasps that her father had given her for her birthday, and in that journal, in handwriting that was already precise and even, because Daphne Greengrass did not do anything carelessly, she had written and rewritten her reasoning until it was airtight. Harry Potter was alive. This was not common knowledge outside certain circles, but Daphne's father was Lord Cyrus Greengrass, and Lord Cyrus Greengrass sat on 4 different Wisengamot subcommittees and had dinner twice a year with people whose names made ministry officials straighten their robes automatically. Daphne had grown up understanding that information was currency and that the most valuable coins were the ones nobody else knew were in circulation. Harry Potter was alive, he was somewhere in the Muggle world, and Dumbledore had put him there. Daphne had spent 6 weeks working out why that bothered her so much, and the conclusion she'd arrived at was simple: it wasn't fair. Not in a childish, foot-stamping way. In a real way, a way that made her jaw tight when she thought about it. A boy who had done something remarkable, something that had saved all of them, including people like the Greengrasses who'd managed to stay carefully neutral, was living in the Muggle world without his history, without his family, without anyone who knew what he was. That was wrong. Daphne Greengrass, who had grown up in a house full of careful pragmatism and cool calculation, was not supposed to care about things being wrong unless they were wrong in ways that affected the Greengrass family directly. She cared anyway. She had gotten the address from a record that technically didn't exist, stored in a subsection of her father's private library that he thought she didn't know about, written in a code that had taken her 11 days to crack. She had written it in her journal in invisible ink and then memorized it and then burned the journal page, which felt dramatic but also correct. She stepped out of the flue at the leaky cauldron, smoothed her dark green robes, told Tom the barman that her father was just behind her. He wasn't, and walked out onto the Muggle street before anyone could ask questions. She had a map. She had worn Muggle clothes, dark jeans, a neat white blouse, her hair pinned back, because she was not an idiot. She had enough Muggle money for a taxi, which she'd taken from her father's desk along with the code key, and which she now used to direct a very confused driver to the end of Privet Drive. She tipped him the way she'd seen her father tip people, with the particular decisive manner that communicated that this was exactly the right amount and that was the end of the conversation. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror like he couldn't quite place what was strange about her, which was exactly the reaction she wanted. She stood at the end of Privet Drive and looked down the street. A girl was already standing on the pavement halfway down. Daphne's eyes narrowed. The girl was younger, maybe, or possibly the same age, hard to tell. Silver blonde hair that sat wrong in normal daylight, like it was generating its own. Pale blue dress. Standing very still in a way that looked deliberate rather than uncertain. Something pulled at Daphne's chest. The same direction the girl was facing. The same house. No, Daphne thought, with a cool, precise fury. Absolutely not. She walked faster. They reached the front path of Number 4 at the same time. The girl with the silver hair looked at Daphne. Daphne looked at the girl with the silver hair. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched just long enough to be a declaration. "You are here for the same reason as me," the silver-haired girl said. Her accent was French, her tone was the kind of polite that meant "I have already decided I don't like you." "I don't know why you're here," Daphne said, "so I can't confirm that." "Harry Potter." Daphne kept her face neutral, which took more effort than she'd have liked. "Who are you?" "Fleur Delacour." Said the way people say their names when they expect the name to do work. "And you?" "Daphne Greengrass." Something moved behind Fleur's eyes, recognition, recalibration, a quick reassessment that she didn't quite hide. The Greengrass name meant something in certain circles. "Good. Let it. You are a long way from France," Daphne said. "You are a long way from anywhere sensible," Fleur returned, and gestured at the Muggle street around them with a slight movement of her head that managed to convey both disdain for the neighborhood and acknowledgement that they were both, equally, standing in it. "Fair point," Daphne conceded internally. She didn't concede it externally. "What do you want with Harry Potter?" she asked instead. "I felt," Fleur stopped. Pressed her lips together briefly, the first real crack in the composure. "I followed something. A feeling. I do not know the Muggle word." She touched her chest, just for a second. Daphne knew exactly what she meant. She'd felt the same thing the moment she'd stepped onto the street, a low, warm pull that had nothing to do with her 6 weeks of planning and everything to do with something she didn't have language for yet. She wasn't going to say that. "I came because it's wrong," Daphne said instead. "What's been done to him? Someone should check." Fleur studied her. Then she said, slowly, "Yes. That is also true." They looked at the house together. It was aggressively ordinary. Flower pots by the door, spotless windows, a doorbell that looked like it had never been used by anyone interesting. "Well," Daphne said, and walked up to the door and knocked. The woman who answered was large in the way that meant she took up more space than her actual size, shoulders pulled back, mouth thin, eyes doing that rapid inventory that some people's eyes did when they were deciding how to be defensive. She was wearing an apron over a yellow dress and she smelled of cleaning products and something Daphne identified, after a moment, as genuine anxiety, present tense and spiking. Her eyes went to Daphne first, Muggle clothes, tidy, clearly not selling anything, and then slid to Fleur, and whatever calculation she'd been running stopped. Fleur's effect on Muggles was more immediate than on wizards, who had at least some defense. The woman blinked. Her expression went soft and strange and confused, the particular confusion of someone experiencing something they have no category for. "Good afternoon," Daphne said crisply. "We're here to see Harry." The woman snapped back to herself, which took visible effort. Her mouth went thin again. Harry doesn't have visitors. He does now, Daphne said. He's not, he's busy. He's not available to, where is he? Fleur said. Her voice was quiet and pleasant and the woman took a half-step backward. Not because of anything threatening in the words. Just because Fleur's voice when she turned it on was like stepping from shade into direct sunlight. Disorienting, even when she wasn't trying. I'm going to have to ask you girls to leave, Aunt Petunia. A man's voice from inside, heavy footsteps. A large man filled the hallway behind the woman, enormous, purple-faced, tiny eyes, and his expression when he saw the two girls on his doorstep did something complicated. Fleur took a slow breath through her nose and said nothing, but something in her posture changed, became very still in the way that prey animals become still when something larger approaches, and Daphne filed that away and felt a cold, specific anger start to build behind her breastbone. Who are they? The man demanded. Friends of Harry's, Daphne said pleasantly. From school. We were in the area. Harry doesn't have friends, the man said, and the way he said it, flat, dismissive, the tone of someone stating an obvious and slightly irritating fact, made the cold anger behind Daphne's breastbone go very quiet and very hard. He does now, Fleur said. Exact same words Daphne had used, and Daphne glanced sideways at her involuntarily. Fleur wasn't looking at her. There was a sound. Small, barely a sound at all, just a shift, a scrape, from somewhere to the right, deeper in the hallway, at floor level, and both girls heard it at the same moment. Both girls' heads turned. There was a door under the stairs. A small door, barely more than a hatch, the kind that should have opened onto cleaning supplies or old shoes. It had 2 locks on it. 2 locks and a bolt that was shot from the outside. The pull in Daphne's chest went from warm to a roar. The woman, Petunia, moved, just slightly, positioning herself. It was a small movement and it was the worst thing she could have done, because it was a guilty movement, the movement of someone who knew exactly what was being noticed and was trying too late to block the sight line. Daphne walked forward. The man moved to block her and Fleur stepped forward with him, not aggressively, just into his peripheral vision, and said, "Don't," in a tone that landed like a hand pressed flat on a table, and the man stopped, not because Fleur was physically imposing, she was 9 and small for it, but because something in that single syllable communicated, without any room for misinterpretation, that he did not want to find out what happened next. Daphne crouched in front of the door under the stairs and slid back the bolt. She had to try twice on the first lock and then she gave up on the second one and said, very quietly, so only the door could hear it, "Alohomra." Just the word, wandless, because she'd been practicing for 8 months and because some magic, the magic that lives in intention rather than tools, will work when you need it badly enough. The lock clicked. She opened the door. The smell hit her first. Clean, just barely, someone kept it from being worse, but underneath the clean, something stale, something that spoke of walls very close and air that didn't move. It was dark inside. No window. A single bare mattress that was too small for the space and too worn for any space. A shelf of broken toys. 3 pairs of socks folded with the precision of someone who had very little and took very good care of what they had. A boy sat on the mattress with his knees pulled to his chest and his back against the wall. He was 7 years old and he had black hair that went in every direction and round glasses that were cracked at the corner and held together with what looked like a piece of sticking plaster. He had green eyes that were, and this was the thing that landed in Daphne's chest like something thrown hard, not frightened. Not the eyes of someone who'd been crying or panicking. Watchful. Careful. The eyes of someone who had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do when something unknown happened was to react to it, because reactions got punished and stillness was safer. 7 years old and he had already learned that. Fleur made a sound behind her. Not a word. The kind of sound you make when something knocks the breath out of you. "Hello," the boy said. His voice was careful too, sizing them up with the same quiet attention as the eyes. "Hello," Daphne said. She kept her voice very steady, very normal, because she understood instinctively that anything that felt like pity would close him down. "I'm Daphne. This is Fleur." The boy looked from her to Fleur and back. His eyes were doing the same rapid assessment that hers did, she realized. Filing things. Working out safe and not safe. "You came through the front door," he said. "Yes. They don't usually let people in." "We didn't ask," Daphne said. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile but the shape that precedes one. "Okay," he said. "Harry." Fleur had crouched down too, she was level with the doorway, her silver hair catching even the dim light from the hallway and doing something unreasonable with it. Harry looked at her and didn't go soft and strange the way the woman at the door had. He just looked at her. Directly, steadily, like she was a person rather than a light source. Fleur blinked, and something in her expression changed in a way that Daphne couldn't quite name but watched anyway. "How long have you been in there today?" Fleur asked. Harry considered the question with apparent seriousness, working back through it. "Since breakfast." "And before today?" "A while." He didn't say how long. He picked up his socks and put them in his pocket with the automatic tidiness of someone who moved quickly when doors opened. "Are you taking me somewhere?" Daphne stood up and turned around. The man and the woman were still in the hallway. The woman had her arms crossed, her face pulled into something she probably thought was dignified. The man was red. "Yes," Daphne said. To Harry first, and then, looking at the man and woman, again, "Yes." "You can't just," the man started. "He's our ward," Daphne said, which was not true but was the kind of not true that was very difficult to immediately disprove, and Cyrus Greengrass's daughter had spent her whole life watching her father use the exact weight of assertion needed to keep people too uncertain to push back. "There's been a placement concern. We're here on behalf of the family. You'll be contacted." None of this made sense. The man's mouth opened and closed. The woman said, sharply, "His things, he'll have new things," Fleur said. She had stood up and was offering Harry her hand. Harry looked at it for a moment, the careful assessment again, the weighing of this, and then he took it. His hand was small. The bones were too close to the surface. Fleur's expression didn't change but her free hand curled into a fist at her side. Harry stepped out of the cupboard and straightened up, his cracked glasses catching the light, and he looked at the hallway of Number 4 Privet Drive with an expression that was not triumph or relief or grief but something quieter and more complete, the expression of someone finishing a sentence they'd been constructing for a long time. "My book," he said. "Pardon?" Daphne said. "I have a book. On the shelf." He looked back at the cupboard. "A nature encyclopedia. It was left in a bin and I found it." He was looking at her, not asking, exactly, but watching to see what she did with the information. Daphne reached into the cupboard, found the book, battered, water-stained, clearly rescued from somewhere it had no business being rescued from, and handed it to him. He held it against his chest with both arms. "Thank you," he said. The hallway was very quiet. Vernon Dursley found his voice somewhere in the vicinity of his outrage. "Now see here, I don't know who you think you are, coming into my house and making these claims. I am Harry's legal guardian and you are two little girls and I will be calling the police?" Daphne said. "By all means." She reached into her pocket and produced a small card that was, technically, blank, but she held it as though it had printing on it. "Ask for the welfare division. Tell them about the cupboard." The red in Vernon Dursley's face went through several stages and arrived somewhere between purple and white. "If we are contacted about Harry by anyone," Fleur said, her voice still pleasant, still light, still carrying that particular quality that made people feel like the sun was in their eyes, "we will come back. And we will not come back alone. She squeezed Harry's hand once, briefly. Harry looked up at her. He hadn't let go. "Ready?" Daphne said to him. Harry Potter looked at the cupboard. Looked at the Dursleys. Looked at the two girls on either side of him, one who'd given him her hand and one who'd got his book. His cracked glasses were slightly crooked, there was a bruise on his left arm that Daphne was not going to look at right now because if she looked at it right now she was going to do something inadvisable, and he was wearing a shirt 4 sizes too large that had clearly belonged to someone bigger, and he was carrying a water-damaged nature encyclopedia like it was a considerable treasure. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They walked out the front door and down the path and onto Privet Drive, and behind them the door of number 4 clicked shut, and none of them looked back. They made it to the end of the street before the immediate problem of where exactly are we going arrived. "Do you have somewhere?" Daphne asked Fleur. "I arrived by Broken Port Key," Fleur said, with the dignity of someone who was not going to be embarrassed about this. "I have no flue access and I cannot apparate reliably." "I have the leaky cauldron," Daphne said. "I told them my father was coming." "Is he?" Daphne looked at her. "Right," Fleur said. "So he is coming now. He's going to be furious. My mother also." They looked at each other. Then they both looked at Harry, who was standing between them on the pavement examining his book's cover with the focused attention of someone who had learned to be very present in small moments. "Harry," Daphne said. He looked up. "Do you know what you are? What your family is?" Something moved through his eyes. Complicated and layered, like he'd thought about this often from multiple angles and still hadn't arrived at certainty. "Aunt Petunia says I'm abnormal," he said. "Uncle Vernon says I'm a freak. The school thinks I'm disturbed." He listed these without particular emotion, the way you list facts that are no longer interesting because they've been true so long. "Things happen around me sometimes. When I'm upset, or scared." He looked at his hands. "I don't know what it is." "It is magic," Fleur said. Her voice was different now, the pleasant weapon quality gone, replaced by something genuine and direct. "You are a wizard, Harry. Your parents were a witch and a wizard. You are." She looked sideways at Daphne for half a second, and Daphne understood the pause. She was deciding how much to say about the rest. "Famous," Daphne finished, keeping her voice neutral. "People know your name. You did something important when you were very small. We can explain properly when we're somewhere safe." Harry turned this over. "Famous," he repeated. "Very," Daphne said. "For what?" A pause. "You survived something that no one had ever survived before," Fleur said carefully. Harry considered this with what Daphne was already recognizing as his characteristic method: take the thing in, look at it from several angles, don't react until you understand it. "Huh," he said finally. "That's all you have to say?" Daphne said. He looked up. "What should I say?" She didn't have an answer for that. "I knew something was different," he said, with the simple, unarguable confidence of someone who had been certain of a thing alone for so long that confirming it was almost boring. "I just didn't know what." He looked at Fleur. "You have magic too." "Yes. You're different from regular magic, though." His head tilted slightly. "I can feel it. It's like, yours has a different color. Sort of gold." Fleur went very still. Daphne looked at him sharply. "You can see magic," she said. He blinked. "Isn't that normal?" "No," they said together. Harry processed this, looked briefly uncertain, the first moment of genuine uncertainty she'd seen in him, and then settled back into his composure. "Well," he said. "I've never had anyone to compare with." He looked at Daphne. "What color is mine?" Fleur asked, still not quite recovered. "Green," he said. "Dark green. But not like something bad. Like something old." Like a forest. He looked at Daphne. Yours is ice blue. Same shade as, he touched the corner of his glasses, like frozen water when it's deep. You can see through it but it's strong. Daphne Greengrass, who had never in her life been at a loss for her next sentence, said nothing for approximately 3 seconds. We need to get to the leaky cauldron, she said. Getting a 7-year-old in Muggle clothes, a 9-year-old in a French dress, and an 8-year-old in precise Muggle chic onto a bus to London was, it turned out, both easier and stranger than it had any right to be. Harry knew the bus. He'd clearly taken it before, or watched it enough to know how it worked, and he paid their fares from a small collection of Muggle coins he produced from his too large shirt pocket with the particular economy of someone who'd learned to save very small amounts of money very carefully. Fleur looked at the coins and then looked at Harry's shirt, and Daphne could see something crystallizing in her expression, something that had been forming since the cupboard, something that was going to be significant. They sat at the back. Harry between them, which had happened naturally, without discussion, the way some arrangements simply resolve. Your parents, Harry said, after a while. The bus was moving, London opening around them like a held breath releasing. They know where you are? No, Daphne said. No, Fleur confirmed. They're going to be angry. Enormously, Daphne said. Harry looked out the window. The city sliding past, grey and enormous and indifferent. You came anyway, he said. Not a question. Yes, Fleur said. Why? Fleur opened her mouth and closed it, which Daphne suspected was rare. I felt something, she said finally. Pulling me. She touched the hollow of her throat, briefly self-conscious in a way that sat strangely on her confidence. I am part Vila. It is a magical creature, French, my grandmère was one. Sometimes there is she made a gesture, slightly frustrated, reaching for the right word in a language that wasn't her first, a recognition. When something is important. Like a compass, Harry said. Yes. Exactly like that. And yours? Harry looked at Daphne. Daphne had a list of precise, logical, well-constructed reasons that she had spent 6 weeks developing. She looked at Harry Potter, at his cracked glasses and his too big shirt and his nature encyclopedia held tight against his chest and his eyes that were green and careful and already older than 7 had any right to be, and she abandoned all of them. Because you were alone, she said. And that was wrong. So I came. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression did the almost smile again, wider this time, just slightly, the shape of something that hadn't had enough practice. Okay, he said. Outside the window, London kept moving, grey and vast and full of things that were about to change completely. The leaky cauldron was loud with the mid-afternoon crowd, and Tom the barman did a visible double-take when Daphne walked back in, this time with 2 additional children, neither of whom looked like a parent, but she crossed to the bar before he could compose his confusion into a question. I need a private room and a Fleur call, she said. Please. The please was a deliberate addition, a lesson from her father. You say please when you're about to ask for something that could technically be refused, because it changes the frame from request to courtesy between equals. Tom looked at Harry. His eyes went wide in the particular way that happened sometimes when people looked at Harry's forehead, though Harry's fringe covered the scar and Daphne hadn't mentioned names. Something else, then. Something about Harry himself. Of course, Tom said, and his voice had gone different, quieter, more careful. Right this way. He gave them a room without further questions, which was either very good service or the beginning of something spreading, and Daphne suspected, with a cold clarity, that it was the latter. She made her Fleur call from the small fireplace in the private parlor. She put her head into the green flames and said, clearly, Greengrass Manor, Father's study. She had 1 second of hoping he wasn't there. He was there. Lord Cyrus Greengrass was 43 years old, silver-templed, and possessed of the particular still expression of someone who had trained themselves not to show surprise. He was looking at a parchment when she connected and looked up and looked at her and then set the parchment down very deliberately and said, "Daphne." "Father. Where are you?" "The Leaky Cauldron. Private Parlor B." She paused. "I need you to come." "Something happened." "Something happened," he repeated. "Something happened or something you caused to happen." "I found Harry Potter," she said. "He was locked in a cupboard under the stairs of his Muggle relative's house. He's with me now." The study was very quiet. Her father looked at her and she watched him put together the implications, the address, the fact that she knew the address, the fact that she had gone there, the fact that she was calling him now rather than the ministry or anyone else, and she watched something move behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. "Don't speak to anyone. Don't tell anyone who he is." "There's also a French girl," Daphne said. "Half Villa. She was there too. She got there the same time I did." Her father blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him blink like that in 2 years. "Delacour," he said, after a moment. It wasn't a question. "I didn't ask her family name." "Silver blonde hair?" "Was she?" He stopped himself. "It doesn't matter." 10 minutes. "Don't open the parlor door." He pulled back from the fire. The flames went normal again. Daphne straightened up and turned around. Harry was sitting in one of the armchairs looking at his encyclopedia. Fleur was standing at the window looking at the Muggle street outside, her reflection ghostly in the old glass. "My father's coming," Daphne said. "Mine is not," Fleur said, still looking at the window, "but my mother will know something is wrong. I used the emergency port key. She will have felt it." She turned away from the window. "She will be here before your father." "We'll manage whoever arrives first," Daphne said. Harry looked up from his book. He'd been reading, actually reading, his finger moving along a line of text about migration patterns in European starlings. "Are they going to take me back?" he asked. Both girls looked at him. "No," Fleur said. "No," Daphne confirmed. Harry looked at them both for a moment. Then he looked back at his book. "Good," he said, with a simplicity that made the word land heavier than most complicated sentences. "We won't let them," Fleur added, which was slightly less controlled than she'd probably meant to be, and Daphne glanced sideways at her and caught Fleur glancing sideways at Daphne, and they held eye contact for exactly 1 beat of mutual recognition, 2 girls in a small room who had both, separately and completely accidentally, arrived at the exact same place for reasons they didn't fully understand yet, both utterly certain of the one thing they'd just said. Somewhere in magical Britain, the first ripples were already moving. Tom the barman's eyes had gone wide. A fireplace somewhere had already lit green once with news passing between people who shouldn't have known anything yet. The name Harry Potter, spoken in the Leaky Cauldron parlor at 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Tuesday in July, was already beginning its journey outward in all directions, growing as it traveled, gathering mass, gathering weight. But in the room, none of that existed yet. In the room there was a battered nature encyclopedia and a silver-haired girl and a dark-haired girl and a boy with cracked glasses and green eyes who could see the color of magic, sitting in an armchair that was too big for him, reading about starlings. "They fly in murmurations," he said suddenly, not looking up. "The starlings. Thousands of them, all moving together, and nobody's in charge. They just know." He said it like he was telling them something. Daphne sat down. Fleur came away from the window and sat on the arm of the chair across from Harry's, which was not quite what chairs were for, but nobody commented. The light in the room was warm and still. Outside, London was beginning to understand that something had shifted. The door remained closed. Chapter 2, The Arrival of Wolves. Apollon Delacour arrived first. She came through the Leaky Cauldron's public flue at 11 minutes past 3, which meant she had been moving before Fleur had even finished the port key journey, had felt the emergency anchor snap loose from the family wards and been out the door in the time it took most people to find their shoes. She was 32 years old and she moved through the pub's crowded afternoon the way a current moves through standing water, everything yielding slightly without quite knowing why. Tom the barman opened his mouth and she looked at him and he closed it and pointed at the private parlors. She didn't knock. Fleur, to her credit, didn't flinch. She stood up from the arm of the chair and met her mother's entrance with her chin level and her hands clasped in front of her, which was the stance she used when she was certain she was right and prepared to be in serious trouble about it. Fleur Delacour stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter and then looked at the room, at Daphne, at Harry, at the general situation, and the rapid, precise calculation behind her pale eyes was something Daphne recognized because she'd seen it in her own father's face 1,000 times. Working angles. Assessing. Her eyes landed on Harry and stayed. Harry looked up from his book, registered the new person with his usual quiet attention, and said, "Hello." Apollon said something in French, low and quick, that Daphne didn't catch. Then she crossed the room, crouched in front of Harry's chair with the fluid ease of someone who had never once in her life looked awkward doing anything, and looked at him directly. Up close. The way Fleur had in the cupboard, that same intent focus, but older and knowing where Fleur's had been instinctive. "You can look at me," she said. Her accent was thick but her English was precise. Directly. "It is all right." Harry looked at her directly, which was notable because most adults, most people, couldn't hold Fleur Delacour's gaze for more than 3 seconds without their eyes wanting to slide away to something safer. Harry held it without effort, with that same steady watchfulness, and something moved through Apollon's face that looked remarkably like relief. "He doesn't glamour," Fleur said, from behind her mother. There was something in her voice, not pride, exactly, but adjacent to it. "No," Apollon agreed, quietly. She sat back on her heels. "Harry. I am Apollon. Fleur's mother. Are you hurt?" Harry considered this with the seriousness of someone taking the question literally rather than socially. "My arm," he said. "From before. Not from today." Apollon's expression didn't change but she took Harry's left arm, very gently, and pushed up the too large sleeve. The bruise was old, yellowing at the edges, the shape of fingers. The room went very quiet. "Maman," Fleur said. "I see it," Apollon said, in a voice that was perfectly level and communicated several things simultaneously through that levelness. She released Harry's arm with the same gentleness. "How long have you lived here, Harry? In this house?" "Always," Harry said. "Since I was 1. Apollon stood up. She turned to look at her daughter. Fleur met her eyes steadily, and something passed between them that was entirely private, the specific communication of people who are having a full conversation without words, and then Apollon said, "You were right to come," and Fleur let out a breath that she'd clearly been holding since the door opened. Daphne, who had been watching all of this from her chair, heard the flue ignite in the main room and recognized the sound of expensive boots on the pub floor and stood up. Cyrus Greengrass did not move through rooms the way Fleur Delacour did. He moved through them differently, deliberately, each step measured, the way a person moves when they want you to have time to register them before they arrive. He was tall, silver-templed, wearing robes that were the precise shade of charcoal that communicated money without advertising it. He knocked once on the parlor door, which was a courtesy, and opened it without waiting for a response, which was the other thing. He saw Daphne, and something in his posture settled. She was unharmed, she was composed, she was standing, which meant she was prepared to be accountable for herself. Then his eyes went to Fleur Delacour and he stopped moving. "Apollon," he said. "Cyrus," she said. The quality of the air between them was the quality of two people who knew each other well enough to have complicated feelings about it. "You were faster," he said. "I always am." A pause. "Is the boy?" "He is here," Apollon said, and stepped aside. Cyrus Greengrass looked at Harry Potter and did the same thing his daughter had done, the same rapid, many-angled assessment. Harry looked back at him with the same calm attention he'd given everyone today, and Daphne watched her father encounter, probably for the first time in years, someone whose first instinct was not to defer to him. 7 years old, cracked glasses, too big shirt, nature encyclopedia in his lap. Returning Cyrus Greengrass's gaze without any particular effort. "Hello, sir," Harry said. Her father blinked. "Hello," he said, and it came out slightly more genuine than he'd probably intended, the word softened by surprise. He looked at Daphne. "Explain." Daphne explained. She was concise about it, because that was what he'd always trained her to be, the relevant facts in the right order, no editorializing until the frame is established. The address, how she'd gotten it. The arrival. Fleur already being there. The cupboard. She described the cupboard in 3 sentences, each precise, and watched her father's jaw tighten on the second one and go rigid on the third. 2 locks, he said. And a bolt, she confirmed. Shot from outside. Cyrus looked at Harry again. Harry had been listening to all of this without visible reaction, which Daphne suspected meant he'd also processed the implications of being discussed in third person and decided that this was more informative than objecting to it. "You're not upset," Cyrus said to him. Directly, genuinely curious. Harry thought about it. "I was in there for a while," he said. "I've had time to think about things." "What did you think about?" "Mostly I thought about starlings." A pause. "And whether today was different from other days." "I thought about that for a bit." "And is it?" Harry looked at Daphne, then at Fleur. "Yeah," he said. "It's different." Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to the room in general, "We need to discuss what happens next." "We do," Apollon agreed. "My instinct is Gringotts," Cyrus said, pulling a chair out and sitting in a way that was half settling in and half claiming the space. "Before anyone else hears that he's been found and starts managing the story. If we get in front of the goblins first, establish custody of record, he is not a contract to be filed," Apollon said pleasantly. "I'm describing a practical step, not a, you are describing a move in a game," Apollon said, in exactly the same pleasant tone, and the word game landed with enough weight to stop him. "Maman," Fleur said. "He is not wrong about the timing." Apollon looked at her daughter. "If people find out he is here and there is no legal framework around him, then the Ministry will take him. Or Dumbledore will take him back to exactly where he was." Fleur's voice was steady, her chin level, arguing with her mother in front of 3 other people with the focused composure of someone who'd clearly done it before and knew how to do it well. "We should move quickly. It does not mean he is a contract." Apollon regarded her daughter for a long moment with an expression that Daphne recognized because she'd seen it on her own father's face when she surprised him, something between pride and the particular discomfort of being out-argued by someone you raised. "Quickly, then," Apollon said. Harry closed his book. "I'd like to go to Gringotts," he said. Everyone looked at him. "I'd like to know what's mine," he said, with a simple, unhurried directness that made the sentence much larger than its words. "If there's a vault or something. I'd like to see it." He looked at his hands, the ones that could see the color of magic. "I'd like to know what I am, properly. Not just, what people say." He looked up. "Is that what Gringotts does?" "Partly," Daphne said. "Then yes," he said. "Let's go." Getting 5 people from the leaky cauldron to Gringotts in a way that avoided notice was a project that Cyrus Greengrass managed with the efficiency of a man who had conducted sensitive business through Diagon Alley many times. Apollon took Harry's hand on one side and Fleur appeared on the other, which left Daphne walking beside her father in their wake, close enough to keep the group tight. The timing was bad in the way that all times of day in Diagon Alley were bad when you wanted to be unobserved, crowded enough that individuals blurred together, but with pockets of stillness around shop doors where people stopped to look at things, and those pockets were the ones that caught you. Daphne watched the moment they were caught. It was a witch outside flourish and blots, middle-aged, the kind of person who attended every ministry social function and was present at every significant event not because she was important but because she had made a science of being wherever things were happening. Her eyes went to the group, did a polite slide away, and then snapped back to Harry. Harry's scar was covered by his fringe. She hadn't seen it. But something else had caught, maybe his eyes, maybe the particular quality of the magic around him that Daphne couldn't see but others might feel, maybe just the combination of a Fleur Delacour and Cyrus Greengrass walking together in the same direction with clear purpose at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Daphne kept walking. Didn't look back. But she touched her father's arm lightly. "Saw," she said, very quietly. "So did I," he murmured. "We have perhaps 2 hours before it's everywhere. Is that enough?" "It will have to be." They took the marble steps of Gringotts in a single continuous movement and were inside before the witch had finished turning around. The goblin at the central desk was named Sharpclaw, and he had the specific kind of patience that was indistinguishable from contempt for all human time management. He looked at the group over the edge of his desk with eyes that had seen 5,000 years of wizarding commerce and found nothing remarkable about any of it. "We require a private heritage consultation," Cyrus said. "For a minor." "Name," Sharpclaw said. "The minor's name is," Cyrus glanced around the marble hall, at the other wizards moving between counters, and lowered his voice, "Potter." Sharpclaw's eyes moved to Harry. They stayed there for 3 seconds, which for a goblin was a visible reaction. He reached under his desk without looking away and rang a small bell. Another goblin materialized at Sharpclaw's shoulder with impressive promptness. "Griphook," Sharpclaw said. "Heritage Suite. Priority." "Of course," said Griphook, who had sharp teeth and the bright, assessing eyes of someone who found humans interesting in the way that collectors find objects interesting. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him, and the same thing happened that happened when Harry looked at everyone, the direct, unshifting attention, taking the measure without performing anything. Griphook, remarkably, showed the smallest trace of satisfaction. "This way," he said. The Heritage Suite was deep in Gringotts, past the public counters and down a corridor that smelled of old stone and older gold. The room they were taken to had a round table of dark wood, chairs that were sized for humans without being designed with human comfort in mind, and walls lined with narrow shelves of objects whose purposes were not immediately obvious. A second goblin was already there, older, waiting. "Bloodright," Griphook said, introducing him. Bloodright looked at Harry with the same quality of attention as Griphook, but more deliberate, more specific. He was holding a piece of parchment and a small knife that he set on the table without ceremony. "Heritage assessment for Harry James Potter," he said. "This is standard. 3 drops of blood on the parchment. The parchment does the work." He looked at Harry. "You understand?" Harry looked at the knife. "It'll tell me who I am. It will tell you your bloodline, your inheritances, your status, and any active magical contracts or bonds of record." A pause. "Given your particular situation, we expect the results to be extensive." Harry reached out and picked up the knife before Apollon could reach for it, before anyone could soften the moment with an intermediary. He pressed the blade to the tip of his index finger, quick and clean, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the parchment. Then something happened that made even Bloodright lean forward. The parchment didn't just fill with writing. It blazed. Gold light spreading from the blood drops outward, not in lines of text but in a web, a complex, branching structure that filled the whole page and then expanded past its edges and hung in the air above the table, hovering in 3 dimensions, burning quietly. Bloodright looked at Griphook. Griphook looked at Bloodright. "Well," Griphook said. The word carried a weight of satisfaction that Daphne recognized as professional appreciation. A goblin who had just found that an account contained more than expected. The writing resolved itself after a moment into actual legible lines, and Daphne craned forward to read. Harry James Potter, son of James Charles Potter and Lily Jane Potter, née Evans, heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter, heir to the ancient and most noble house of Peveril, dormant, activated upon his magical maturity, blood adopted heir to the ancient and noble house of Black, pending formal activation, status, lord-in-waiting by right of all three lines, and then, below the lineage, a second section that made the room go completely still, bonds of record, soul resonance bond, active and binding, anchored to living magical signatures. No formal contract exists, but magical law recognizes the bond as precedent protected under the Merlin Accords of 893 AD. Bond class, threefold anchor. Parties identified: Potter, Harry James Delacour, Fleur Isabel Greengrass, Daphne Lyra. The air in the heritage suite stayed perfectly still for a long moment. Daphne looked at the parchment. Then she looked at Fleur. Fleur was looking at the parchment with an expression that was very controlled in a way that meant it was controlling something large. Her eyes moved to Daphne. They looked at each other. Then, without any apparent coordination, they both looked at Harry. Harry was reading the parchment. Reading it carefully, the same way he'd read about starlings. Working through it. When he got to the bonds section, his lips moved slightly with the longer words, which was so completely a 7-year-old thing to do in the middle of an ancient magical revelation that Daphne felt something in her chest shift sideways into a shape she didn't have a name for yet. He looked up. "What's a threefold anchor?" "An old magic," Bloodright said, and his voice had gone careful in the way that knowledgeable people's voices go careful when they are choosing precision over completeness. "Very old. It is not created by choice or ceremony. It forms when three magical signatures of compatible nature achieve proximity at the moment of significant emotional resonance." He glanced between the three children. "In this case, we believe, the proximity occurred today. At the time of your separation from your previous circumstances." "The cupboard," Harry said. "Most likely." Harry looked back at the parchment. "So there," he gestured, vaguely, at Fleur and Daphne, "stuck to me now?" "You are all three bonded to each other," Bloodright said. "The anchor is not one-directional." Fleur made a small sound. It might have been protest. It might have been something else entirely. "What does it mean?" Cyrus asked. His voice was controlled and careful, but Daphne knew her father well enough to hear the seismic activity underneath. "In practical terms?" Bloodright sat back. "The bond will strengthen with time and proximity. It cannot be dissolved by legal instrument, because it predates legal instruments. The Merlin Accords recognized bonds of this class because they had already existed for 600 years before the Accords were written." He paused. "Any formal contract that conflicted with it would be legally void. Any institutional attempt to permanently separate the three parties would face significant magical and legal obstruction." He looked at Cyrus with the calm precision of someone delivering information that is going to be very inconvenient for the person receiving it. "The bond is also, under current wizarding law, a matter of public magical record. Gringotts is obligated to register it. Once registered, it is visible to any party who performs a standard record search on any of the three names." Cyrus processed this. "So within hours," Griphook said helpfully. "Possibly less, given current interest in the primary party." His bright eyes moved to Harry. "You are going to be very discussed, Mr. Potter." Harry picked up his nature encyclopedia from the table where he'd set it down. "I've been discussed my whole life," he said. "At least now it's for something real." Apollon made a soft sound. It was entirely French and entirely maternal, and it made Fleur straighten up in a way that was clearly involuntary. "We need to address the custody question," Cyrus said. "Before the registration hits the public record and the ministry decides to have an opinion." "Agreed," Apollon said. "Harry," she turned to him, "do you understand what we are discussing? We want to make sure you are protected. Legally. So that what happened at that house cannot happen again." Harry looked at her steadily. What happens if I say I want to stay with Daphne and Fleur? The room went very quiet. We are not 17, Fleur said. We cannot be guardians. I know, Harry said. But they could live where I live. Or I could live where they live. If the bond thing is real. He looked at Bloodright. Is it real? Actually real, not just words on a paper. Irrefutably, Bloodright said. Then anyone who tries to separate us is working against the magic, Harry said. Right? Not just inconvenienced by it, actually working against something that's been real since. He looked at the parchment, 893 AD. That is a correct interpretation, Bloodright said, and there was something in his voice that Daphne identified as respect. The specific goblin form of it, which was less warm than the human version but more reliable. Harry nodded once, with the air of someone who has completed a logical process and arrived at a defensible position. Then I'd like to stay near them, he said. And I'd like someone to tell Dumbledore that. He looked at Cyrus. Politely, if possible. But clearly. Cyrus Greengrass looked at his 8-year-old daughter. Daphne met his eyes. He found the address himself, he said, very quietly. Not quite to anyone. Yes, she said. Something moved through his face. God help the man who underestimates any of you, he said, which was, Daphne noted this, the most sincere thing she'd heard her father say in recent memory. They were given a set of rooms in Gringotts itself for the remainder of the afternoon while the legal mechanics were put in motion, and the rooms were deep enough in the building that no owl could reach them and no flow was active, which was the point. Apollon and Cyrus were in the outer room with Bloodright and a stack of parchment in what sounded like a structured but escalating disagreement about the relative merits of the Delacour family's position versus the Greengrass family's position in matters of the bond. It was being conducted very politely, which meant it was serious. Daphne, Fleur, and Harry were in the inner room. It had a low couch and a table and a goblin-made lamp that gave off warm golden light without any visible source. Harry was sitting on the floor with his back against the couch. He had opened his encyclopedia again but he wasn't reading it, his eyes were unfocused, his finger resting in the middle of a page about migratory birds. Fleur was sitting on the couch, her dress spread around her, her silver hair loose now that the afternoon had settled. She was watching Harry with the direct attention she'd had since the cupboard, but it was different now, less assessing, more simply present. Daphne sat at the table. She had borrowed parchment and a quill from Bloodright on the way in, and she was making notes in the neat, precise handwriting that her father had spent 2 years teaching her and that she now used without thinking. What are you writing? Harry asked, without looking up from his non-reading. Who knows what, she said. Who might do what? What the bond means for everyone's position. What the ministry will want. She paused. What Dumbledore will do. What will he do? Daphne looked at the parchment. Try to put things back the way they were, she said. He believes the Dursley placement was necessary. He won't simply accept that it wasn't. Harry was quiet for a moment. Why did he put me there in the first place? Protection, Fleur said, from the couch. Your mother created a blood ward when she died for you. It is tied to a blood relative. While you lived there, the ward held. Harry processed this. Is the ward gone now? We do not know, Fleur said honestly. It may be. Or it may have, transferred. Changed. She tilted her head slightly. Maman knows more about this than I do. She seems like she knows a lot of things, Harry said. She does, Fleur said. A pause. She also worries excessively. She came here in 11 minutes after you used an emergency port key, Daphne said. That's not excessive. That's reasonable. Fleur glanced at her sideways. She also once sent 16 owls to the French equivalent of this institution because I was 15 minutes late returning from a friend's house. That is somewhat excessive, Daphne aloud. Something tugged at the corners of Harry's mouth. He was looking between them now, his non-reading fully abandoned, tracking the exchange with what looked like genuine delight at the existence of this kind of ordinary conversation. Like he'd heard about this sort of thing but hadn't quite believed it was real. "You don't like each other," he said, thoughtfully. Both girls looked at him. "You're being nice," he said. "But you're also," he considered his words, circling. "Like you're trying to figure something out about each other." Daphne looked at Fleur. Fleur looked at Daphne. Neither of them had a quick response to this, which was, Daphne acknowledged privately, fairly unusual for both of them. "I don't not like her," Daphne said finally. "I do not like her," Fleur said simultaneously. They both stopped. "That is a lot of nots," Harry said. "It means we're trying to figure out how to like each other," Daphne said, because she was not going to be less honest than a 7-year-old in her own internal dialogue. "We arrived at the same place for the same reason and we don't know what to do with that yet." Fleur looked at her for a moment. Then she said, in a tone that had most of its defenses down, "I was afraid you would be awful." "I was afraid you would be impossible," Daphne said. "Am I?" Daphne thought about it honestly. "You're more practical than I expected." "Given the entrance." Fleur's mouth curved. "And you are warmer than I expected." "Given the name." "The Greengrass name isn't cold." "It is precise," Fleur said. "Precision can look like cold if you are standing in the wrong light." Harry was watching this with the absorbed attention he gave everything that was new and real and his. "Are you going to be friends?" he asked. "Possibly," Daphne said. "We are already in a magical bond together," Fleur pointed out. "Whether or not we choose friendship seems somewhat academic at this point." "That's not how it works," Harry said. Both girls looked at him. "A bond doesn't make you friends," he said. "It just means you matter to each other. You still have to choose." He said this with the quiet certainty of someone who had thought about the difference between being connected to people and being chosen by them and understood it from the inside out. "I think you'll choose it, though," he added. Neither of them answered, but neither of them dismissed it either. From the outer room, the structured disagreement between Apollon and Cyrus had shifted into something that sounded more like active collaboration, which was either a very good sign or the prelude to a shared catastrophe, and Daphne couldn't determine which. She made a note on her parchment that read check tone every 20 minutes and then looked at it and crossed it out because even she had limits. "Harry," she said. He looked up. "What do you actually want?" "Not what's legal. Not what the bond says. Not what's practical." She watched him. "What do you want?" He thought about this for a long moment. Long enough that she'd started to wonder if she'd misjudged the question. "I want to learn magic properly," he said. "I want to not go back there." He glanced at the encyclopedia. "I want books. Real ones, on real things." He looked at Fleur, then at Daphne. He stopped. "Say it," Fleur said, gently. "I want to eat breakfast," he said. "Every day. Without it being a problem." The room was very quiet. Fleur stood up from the couch and crossed to where he was sitting on the floor and sat down beside him against it, close enough that their shoulders touched. Harry looked at her, slightly surprised, and she said nothing, just stayed there. After a moment he looked back at his encyclopedia. Daphne looked at her parchment. She picked up the quill. At the top of the page, in her most careful handwriting, she wrote, "What he gets, when this is done, 1, breakfast." And then she kept writing. The list was going to be long. Outside the Heritage Suite, Magical Britain was beginning to have its first real conversation about the name Harry Potter in 6 years, and the conversation was moving fast, gathering the kind of energy that changes things permanently, the kind of energy that was already too large to stop. Inside, a goblin lamp burned warm and gold, and 3 children sat in the particular quiet of people who have found something real and are, for the moment, holding it carefully. Chapter 3, The Weighing of Worth. The Ministry of Magic moved fast when it was embarrassed. The notice arrived at Gringotts at 6 in the evening, a formal ministry summons, cream parchment, official seal, the kind of document that was designed to communicate authority through its weight and texture alone. It requested the presence of Harry James Potter, his current custodial parties, and any relevant witnesses at a Wisengamot special inquiry session to be held the following morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Bloodright received it, read it twice, and brought it to Cyrus with the expression of someone delivering weather that had been predicted and was arriving precisely on schedule. Cyrus read it and set it on the table without changing expression. "They found out faster than I expected," he said. "Tom," Daphne said, from across the room. Everyone looked at her. The barman. He saw Harry. He would have said something to someone, not from malice, from habit. He's been in that pub for 30 years. Information moves through him the way water moves through pipes. Cyrus looked at his daughter for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." Apollon had read the summons over his shoulder. "They cannot compel Harry to appear. He is a minor." "They can compel his custodial parties," Cyrus said. "And since the question of who those custodial parties are is currently unresolved, it gives them standing to question everyone," Apollon finished. "Including us." "Which is the point," Cyrus said. Harry was sitting on the large couch in the main room now, actually eating, a proper meal that Griphook had arranged with the Gringotts kitchens, roast chicken and bread and something involving pastry that he was working through with the focused attention of someone who was not taking any of it for granted. Fleur sat across from him. Daphne was at the table. Both girls had eaten, but both were watching Harry eat in a way that they probably didn't realize they were doing. "What's the inquiry for?" Harry asked, between bites. He'd been listening to the adult conversation with the particular quality of attention that Daphne had noticed in him since the beginning, absorbing everything without interjecting until he had something precise to ask. "To determine what happens to you," Cyrus said. He was, Daphne noted, one of the very few adults she'd ever seen speak to Harry without any softening, without the particular tonal adjustment people used for children. He spoke to Harry the way he spoke to her, which meant he had already updated his assessment. "There will be people at that inquiry who want to send you back to your aunt's house. There will be people who want to take custody of you for their own reasons. There will be people who want Dumbledore to make the decision because it's easier than making it themselves." He paused. "And there will be people who will do the right thing, if the right thing is made clear enough and inconvenient enough to avoid." Harry ate a piece of bread. "Which kind are you?" Apollon made a soft sound that was almost a laugh. Cyrus was quiet for a moment, and Daphne watched him choose his answer with the deliberateness he brought to every public statement that was also true. "I came here tonight because my daughter told me a child was in a cupboard," he said. "What I do tomorrow will depend on what the room requires." He met Harry's eyes. "But I am not sending you back." Harry nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer," he said. "I try to be honest when I can afford it," Cyrus said. "And when you can't?" "I try to be precise." Harry looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up his fork again. "I can work with that," he said. They stayed in Gringotts overnight. Bloodright arranged rooms, proper ones, deep in the building, ordered in ways that Daphne recognized were extremely serious because she could feel the layers of them when she walked through the door, a sensation like passing through successive pressures of water. Safe. Genuinely safe in a way that Number 4 Privet Drive had never been safe for the person who needed it most. Harry was given a room to himself. Daphne noted that he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he went in, just looking at it, at the bed that was the right size, at the window that showed a magically rendered sky, at the absence of locks on the outside of the door, and then he walked in and sat on the bed and bounced once, experimentally, and then lay back and stared at the ceiling. "Good?" Fleur said, from the corridor. Yeah, he said. Good. He fell asleep within 10 minutes, still in his two big clothes, his encyclopedia on the pillow beside him. Fleur and Daphne stood in the corridor outside his closed door. Tomorrow will be difficult, Fleur said. It will be terrible, Daphne said, because that was more accurate. We need to be prepared. We need him to be prepared, Daphne said. The room won't be moved by us. We're children. Our families have political positions, which means everything we say will be heard through that filter. She looked at the door. He's the only person in that room tomorrow who has no political position. He's the only one they can't discount. Fleur was quiet, turning this over. Then we need to make sure he knows what to say. We need to make sure he knows what he wants to say, Daphne said. There's a difference. If we put words in his mouth it'll be obvious. He needs to say his own things in his own way. She looked at Fleur. Did you see him with my father? He didn't perform. He didn't try to be what the room wanted. He was just himself, Fleur said. Exactly. That's harder to argue with than any prepared statement. Fleur leaned her shoulder against the corridor wall, her silver hair loose, her blue dress slightly rumpled from the day. She looked less armored than she had on the Privet Drive pavement, Daphne thought. Not weaker, different. Like the armor was still there but she was no longer leading with it. You are very strategic, Fleur said. Not as a criticism. I'm my father's daughter, Daphne said. Is that something you chose? The question landed quietly, and Daphne let it sit for a moment before she answered. The strategy, yes. The love of it, yes. She considered, the belief that everything can be won through position and timing. She looked at the closed door. That I'm less sure about. Fleur looked at her. What cannot be won that way? Today, Daphne said simply. Today couldn't be won that way. I had the address and the plan and the reasoning and I walked up that path at exactly the same moment as someone who had none of those things and just felt something and followed it. She paused. We got to the same place. Fleur was quiet for a moment. You are saying my way was equal to yours. I'm saying they were different and they both worked, Daphne said. I don't know what to do with that yet. Fleur smiled. It was the first real smile Daphne had seen from her, not the pleasant weapon expression, not the controlled warmth, but something genuine and slightly crooked and entirely unguarded. Neither do I, she said. They stood there in the quiet corridor for another moment, and then went to their respective rooms, and neither of them said anything else, but the silence had a different texture from the silence on the Privet Drive pavement, easier, like something that had been tightly wound had released one careful degree. In the morning, Apollon produced clothing. This was impressive given that they'd all arrived at Gringotts with nothing, but Fleur Delacour was the kind of person who, when she put her mind to a practical problem, solved it with a completeness that made you briefly wonder why everyone didn't simply ask her to organize everything. She had sent a Patronus to the family's London contact the previous evening and by 8 o'clock there was a trunk at the door with appropriate clothing for everyone, including Harry, because someone had thought to ask Griphook for his measurements. Harry stood in the middle of his room holding a set of robes that fit him and looking at them with an expression that Daphne filed away under things that should never have been noteworthy but are. They're your size, Fleur said, in case the obvious needed saying. I know, he said. He ran his thumb along the hem, which was even, which was the right length, which had clearly been cut for someone his exact dimensions. I've never had anything that was my size. He said it the way he said most of the significant things, flat, factual, no performance of grief. Which was why it worked the way a physical blow works, the impact arriving after the words had already passed. Fleur turned toward the window. Daphne looked at the opposite wall for 3 seconds and breathed through her nose and then said, very calmly, get dressed. We need breakfast before the inquiry. Real breakfast, he said. Yes. Every day this keeps getting better, Harry said, and went to change, and neither girl mentioned the 3 seconds. Breakfast was in a Gringotts private dining room that seated 12 and currently held 5, which gave the meal a slightly formal quality that the food itself undermined completely. There were eggs and toast and fruit and something that Apollon had requested from the kitchen specifically, small French pastries that were crispy outside and soft inside, and that Harry ate 3 of before he registered he was doing it, and Apollon watched this with an expression of such quiet, determined satisfaction that Fleur had to look at her own plate. Cyrus talked through the structure of the Wisengamot inquiry between bites with the clean efficiency of a man briefing a strategy meeting. Who would chair it? Who would be present? What their likely positions were? What the legal framework permitted? He included Harry in this briefing without adjustment, addressing him as he addressed Daphne, which Harry received without reaction but which Daphne suspected mattered to him in ways that would take time to surface. The chair will be Madame Bones, Cyrus said. Amelia Bones. Head of Magical Law Enforcement. She is the best possible chair for this. She is genuinely impartial, which is rare, and she is not manageable, which is rarer. She will run the inquiry properly. He poured himself tea. Dumbledore will be present. He will argue that the original protective arrangement was necessary and should be reinstated in some form. He won't say this directly, he'll argue it as concern for Harry's welfare. Is it? Harry asked. Concern for my welfare? Cyrus looked at him. I believe he genuinely thinks it is, he said carefully. I also believe he is wrong. What about the ward? Fleur asked. The blood protection. If it has broken, it has likely weakened, Apollon said. Not necessarily broken. And it was not the only form of protection available. She looked at Cyrus. There were other options in 1981. He chose the most restrictive one. Because it required Harry to stay in that house, Cyrus said. Yes, Apollon said, and the word was very precise. Harry was eating his last pastry, listening to this with his characteristic stillness. What do I need to do today? He asked. Tell the truth, Daphne said. Completely. Don't soften it. Don't perform. She looked at him directly. The truth of what that house was is the most powerful thing in that room. More powerful than any argument anyone can make about protection or precedent or political position. She paused. You don't have to be angry. You don't have to be sad. Just, accurate. Harry considered this. I can be accurate, he said. We know, Fleur said. The Wisengamot Special Inquiry Chamber was smaller than the main chamber but designed with the same intention, to make whoever was at the center of it feel the weight of institutional attention. A curved bench of seats for the Wisengamot members, a raised chair for the inquiry chair, and in the middle of the floor, a plain chair that was technically just a chair but had the feeling of a stage. They arrived exactly on time. The chamber was full. Not just the required quorum of Wisengamot members but additional observers, the gallery packed with witches and wizards who had heard the name Harry Potter yesterday evening and found their schedules mysteriously clear this morning. Daphne scanned the faces from the doorway and recognized 12 of them immediately. Reporters, too. Ministry officials who had no operational reason to be here, 4. People from old families who would relay proceedings to family councils, 6. And one person she hadn't expected, sitting in the far corner of the gallery with an expression of careful neutrality, Narcissa Malfoy. Interesting. Amelia Bones was already in the chair's seat, her square jaw set, her monocle in place, a stack of parchment before her that she was reading without looking up. She had the competent stillness of a person who needed nothing from a room's attention. Dumbledore was at the bench. He looked, and Daphne absorbed this quickly, tired. Not the theatrical weariness of someone performing concern, but actually tired, in the particular way of someone whose plans had required a great deal of maintenance and had stopped working overnight. He saw Harry come in and something moved across his face that was genuine, she thought, genuine relief at seeing him alive and present, followed almost immediately by something more complicated that she suspected was the collision of that relief with the political reality of the room. His eyes went briefly to Daphne, then to Fleur, then to Cyrus and Apollon, and she watched him recalculate. She held his gaze for 1 second, neutrally, and then looked away. Harry walked to the center chair and sat down, and the chamber responded to this, a subtle shift, the gallery leaning forward, the Wizengamot member's attention sharpening. That was entirely about him and not about anything he did. The pull of Harry Potter's presence in a room, Daphne was beginning to understand, wasn't the pull of fame. It was something else. The way that water finds its level, the way that a room will orient toward the thing in it that is most fundamentally real. Madame Bones looked up from her parchment. She looked at Harry for a moment. "Mr. Potter," she said. Her voice was direct, no performance of either sympathy or authority. "I am Madame Bones. Do you know why you're here?" "To talk about what happens to me," Harry said. "And whether I have to go back." "Both accurate," she said. "Are you comfortable proceeding?" He looked at the chair. "It's a better chair than the one in my cupboard," he said. The gallery was very quiet. Madame Bones held his gaze without flinching. "Indeed," she said. "Then let's begin." The inquiry's first 40 minutes were procedural, the establishment of timeline, the verification of identities, the formal entry of the Gringotts' heritage assessment into the record. Cyrus handled most of this from the advocate's position, smooth and efficient, preempting objections before they formed. Apollon provided the corroborating account of Fleur's arrival and observation at Privet Drive, in a tone that was perfectly factual and somehow more devastating for it. Dumbledore spoke carefully, precisely, from a position that Daphne found she had to credit for its intelligence. He did not defend the Dursleys. He was too wise for that. He defended the ward. He spoke of Lily Potter's sacrifice, of the protection it created, of the genuine danger that remained in the world for Harry, the Death Eaters still at large, the questions about Voldemort's continued existence, and he spoke of these things with the weight of genuine knowledge and genuine concern, and Daphne watched the Wizengamot members respond to him and watched some of them tip toward his position and knew this was the moment. The protection, Dumbledore said, his voice warm and measured, required a specific environment. The blood relationship with Petunia Dursley was the anchor. I understand that the conditions of Harry's living situation were not what any of us would wish. His eyes moved briefly to Harry. And I take full responsibility for not ensuring those conditions were monitored more closely. That is my failure, and I acknowledge it completely. He paused, letting the acknowledgement land, using it. Daphne watched 3 Wizengamot members visibly relax, the admission of fault disarming them as he'd known it would. But the protection itself, he continued, remains necessary. The question before this chamber should not be whether Harry's home life was managed well, it was not, but whether removing him from that blood anchor entirely serves his safety. I argue that it does not. He sat back. Reasonable. Humble. Strategic. Madame Bones nodded. Thank you, Professor Dumbledore. She looked at Harry. Harry. You've been listening. Yes, Harry said. Do you want to respond to anything that's been said? Harry thought about it for a moment. Not performing the pause, actually thinking. Daphne watched the chamber watch him and felt the particular stillness of a room that has unconsciously decided something matters. Professor Dumbledore says the protection was necessary, Harry said. I don't know if that's true. I don't know enough about magic yet to argue about wards. He looked at Dumbledore, directly, without hostility and without deference. But I want to ask something. Dumbledore looked back at him. Of course. Did you know about the cupboard? The chamber went quiet in a different way. A weight-bearing quiet, the kind that holds things up. Dumbledore took a breath. I knew Harry's living conditions were, not my living conditions, Harry said. Quietly, precisely, the way Daphne had said precisely rather than cold. The cupboard specifically. Did you know I slept in there? A pause. I knew there were difficulties. I trusted that family bonds. That's a no, Harry said. That means nobody checked. He looked at the chamber at large, not sweeping it for effect but naturally, the way you look at people when you're including them in a conversation. I'm 7 years old and I've been living in a cupboard since I was 1. My cousin has 2 bedrooms and I have a cupboard. There are bruises on my arm from last month. He pushed up his sleeve, not dramatically, just practically, just showing the evidence the way you show evidence. I'm not telling you this to be sad about it. I'm telling you because if the ward was so important, and protecting me was so important, then checking whether I was okay should also have been important. And nobody did that. The gallery was entirely still. So when Professor Dumbledore talks about what's necessary for my safety, Harry said, I want to know why nobody thought the cupboard was a problem before today. He looked at Madame Bones. I'm not angry about it. I just think it's a relevant question. Amelia Bones looked at him for a long moment. The monocle caught the light. It is, she said. Dumbledore said nothing. His face was the face of a man who was experiencing several complex emotions simultaneously and managing all of them with considerable skill, but Daphne, who had been watching him all morning, saw the one he couldn't quite contain, not guilt, which she'd expected, but something older and more complicated, the expression of someone who has made a decision that felt right for years and is, for the first time, seeing it from an angle that was always there but that he never stood at. The question of the ward can be addressed separately, Cyrus said, from the advocate's position, his voice smooth and well-timed. Warding specialists can assess alternatives to the blood anchor. It is not a binary choice between reinstating Mr. Potter's previous placement and leaving him unprotected. Lord Greengrass is correct, a voice from the bench said. An older witch, Griselda Marchbanks, who had been on the Wisengamot longer than most people could remember and who spoke rarely and always when it mattered. The protection question is technical. It can be resolved technically. The question before this chamber is the welfare question, and on that question this child has just given his testimony. She looked at Dumbledore. Not unkindly, but without any cushioning. Albus. The ward can be reconstructed around a different anchor. You know this. Dumbledore looked at her. Something passed between them that was the specific communication of people who had known each other for half a century and trusted each other and were, at this moment, disagreeing about something important. Yes, he said, quietly. I know this. Then the placement question is resolved, Marchbanks said. She looked at Madame Bones. Madame Bones made a note. We'll need to determine interim custody arrangements, she said. Pending any formal resolution. The Gringotts bond assessment, Cyrus said, establishes that there exists a recognized magical bond between Harry Potter and 2 minor witches, my daughter Daphne Greengrass and Fleur Delacour, ward of Apollon Delacour. He was doing the thing he did best now, laying legal architecture with the ease of someone who'd been building it his whole life. Under the Merlin Accords, a 3-fold anchor bond carries specific protections and obligations. One of those obligations is proximity of the bonded parties during formative magical development. Separation is not merely inconvenient, it actively works against the magical integrity of all 3 children. You're proposing a joint custody arrangement across 2 families, Madame Bones said. I'm proposing that the magical bond be recognized as the primary legal framework, Cyrus said. The custody arrangement follows from that recognition rather than predating it. The Delacour family is French, someone from the bench said. A man, heavy-set, the kind of face that was designed for skepticism. Daphne knew the name, Tiberius Ogden. Old family, moderate politics, reflexive conservatism about anything that involved France. This creates cross-jurisdictional complications, which Gringotts handles across jurisdictions daily, Apollon said, from the gallery, her tone perfectly pleasant. The bank is international. The bond is on their record. The complications are administrative, not substantive. Ogden looked at her. then looked away, which was more or less everyone's response to Fleur Delacour looking directly at them. Fleur, Madame Bones said, turning to where Fleur sat with her mother in the gallery, you are 9 years old. You traveled to England without parental knowledge or permission, used an emergency port key without authorization, and gained access to a child's private residence under false pretenses. A pause. Why? Fleur stood up. She stood the way she'd stood on the Privet Drive path, chin level, hands at her sides, weight balanced. Because I felt the bond before I knew it was a bond, she said. Something told me he needed to be found. I followed that. She looked at Madame Bones steadily. I did it wrong, the methods were wrong, and I would do all of them again. Madame Bones let that sit for a moment. Daphne Greengrass. Same question. Daphne stood. I researched Harry Potter's location using records I accessed without permission, she said. I traveled to his residence without informing my father. I made false claims to his guardians to gain entry. She looked at Madame Bones. Because someone should have done it 6 years ago and nobody had. So I did. She sat down. Madame Bones looked at both girls. Something moved through her face that she didn't entirely suppress. Right, she said. She made several notes. The scratching of her quill in the quiet chamber was very loud. The interim arrangement, she said, without looking up. I'm inclined to propose joint care between the Greengrass and Delacour families, rotating, with Harry's preference given primary weight. She looked at Harry. Does that suit you, Mr. Potter? Harry looked at Daphne. Then at Fleur. His cracked glasses caught the light. Can I still get breakfast every day? Someone in the gallery laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised out of them, and it moved through the room like a window opening, breaking the formal weight of the last 2 hours. Yes, Madame Bones said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. That can be arranged. Harry nodded. Then yes, he said. That suits me. The inquiry concluded at 11:30. The formal determinations were straightforward once the room had tipped, interim custody split between the Greengrass and Delacour families pending full legal resolution, a warding specialist to be appointed within the week to address the blood anchor question, and a formal censure to be issued regarding the conditions of Harry's previous placement, the language of which Madame Bones wrote herself, in ink that Daphne suspected was the color of genuine fury rather than procedural obligation. Dumbledore left without speaking to Harry directly, which Daphne thought was deliberate, not avoidance exactly, but the withdrawal of a man who needs to revise something before he returns to the conversation. He paused near the door and looked back once. Harry was talking to Griphook, who had appeared at the chamber entrance at the inquiry's close, apparently with some additional point about the heritage assessment. Harry was listening to him with the same focused attention he gave everything, his encyclopedia under his arm, his proper-fitting robes. Apollon had ensured he wore them this morning, making him look, for the first time, like what he actually was. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked out. Marchbanks appeared at Daphne's elbow. She was very old and very small and had the particular quality of presence that extremely old witches develop, a density, like all the magic they'd done over the decades had compressed into a smaller and smaller space and made it heavier. You were good in there, she said to Daphne, quietly, not making a presentation of it. I barely said anything, Daphne said. Knowing when not to speak is the hardest thing, Marchbanks said. She looked at Harry, at Fleur, at the three of them in the chamber. I've been on the Wisengamot since before your father was born. I've seen bond assessments before. Never one like that. She touched the parchment tucked under her arm. You understand what you're part of, child? I'm beginning to, Daphne said. Marchbanks made a sound that was half agreement and half something Daphne couldn't classify. The threefold anchor hasn't been active in recorded wizarding history, she said. The Merlin Accords only describe it because Merlin knew it was possible. He had seen it, apparently, in his own time. She looked at Daphne with eyes that had seen a great deal. "Take care of it." She moved away toward the exit, and Daphne stood with the weight of what she'd said settling carefully onto her shoulders. Fleur appeared at her side. "What did she say?" "The bond hasn't been active before," Daphne said. "In recorded history." Fleur was quiet for a moment. They watched Harry, who had finished with Grip Hook and was now standing with Apollon, and Apollon was doing something that Daphne needed a second to identify. She was straightening his collar, a small, practical, entirely maternal gesture, and Harry was standing very still, his face turned slightly away, but he wasn't pulling back. "He doesn't know how to accept it," Fleur said softly. "No," Daphne said. "He will learn," Fleur said. Not hoping. Stating. "He will," Daphne agreed. Harry looked up then, as though the conversation had somehow reached him across the room, and found both of them watching him. He didn't look away. Didn't do the self-conscious shift that most people did when they caught someone watching them. He just looked back, at both of them, with those careful green eyes that could see colors that no one else saw, and he did the almost smile, slightly wider than yesterday, incrementally more practiced. Daphne looked at Fleur. Fleur looked at Daphne. The bond registered as something warm at the center of her chest, not the cold architecture of law and record and ancient parchment, but something living and responsive, the same thing she'd felt pulling her down Privet Drive, except now it had a shape and a name and 3 people standing inside it. "Right," Daphne said. "Right," Fleur agreed. They crossed the chamber to where Harry was standing, and Cyrus Greengrass watched them go with an expression that was many things at once: political calculation, genuine warmth, the particular complicated love of a father watching his daughter move towards something she has chosen completely. He said nothing. Sometimes the best move was no move at all. Outside the inquiry chamber, Magical Britain was going to spend the rest of the week talking about nothing else. Inside, 3 children walked out of a formal proceeding and into a corridor that smelled of old stone and floor polish, and Harry said, "Can we get lunch? Actual lunch?" And Fleur said, "Yes, obviously," and Daphne said, "I know a place," and they walked down the corridor together, their footsteps overlapping in a rhythm that was already, without anyone deciding it, synchronized. Chapter 4, The Education of Harry Potter. 3 weeks into what Daphne privately called the new arrangement, Harry Potter set a practice dummy on fire without a wand, from across the room, while reading. He didn't notice immediately. He was lying on his stomach on the garden lawn of Greengrass Manor, encyclopedia open in front of him, a proper one now, a magical natural history volume that Cyrus had produced from the manor library with the deliberate casualness of someone who had thought carefully about what to give and wanted it to look unconsidered, and he was reading about magical weather patterns in the Scottish Highlands. The dummy, a standard training figure that Daphne had been using for basic hex practice, was standing 20 feet away near the hedgerow. It caught fire at the hem, blue-white, the specific color of accidental magic that hasn't been channeled through any tool or intention. Fleur saw it first. She was sitting cross-legged on the grass nearby, working through a French primer on elemental theory that her mother had sent with the week's owl post, and she looked up at the sound of something catching and said, quite calmly, "Harry." Harry looked up. Looked at the dummy. "Oh," he said. "Oh," Daphne repeated, from the garden bench where she'd been making notes. She looked at the fire. It was climbing steadily, the blue-white at the base shifting to gold at the top. "Harry, what are you thinking about?" "Wind patterns," he said. "In the Cairngorms. They describe how the magic in storm systems." He looked at his hand, which had a faint luminescence that Daphne could now recognize as his tell, the way his power surfaced through his skin when something had caught his interest too completely. "Is that bad?" "Put it out first," Daphne said. Harry looked at the dummy. He held out one hand, not dramatically, just the way you point at something to indicate intent, and the fire went out cleanly, no smothering, no countercharm, just, gone, like a light switched off. The dummy stood there slightly blackened and smoking gently. He looked at his hand. Then at Fleur. "Did you see a color?" Green, Fleur said. With gold edges, this time. It does that when it's warm, he said, nodding like this confirmed something. He turned back to his book. Daphne looked at Fleur. Fleur looked at Daphne. They'd been having this particular exchange with increasing frequency over the past 3 weeks, the silent conversation that amounted to "did you see that?" followed by "yes," followed by "what do we do with that?" followed by "we have no idea," and they'd gotten efficient at it. "Harry," Daphne said. That was wandless fire generation and suppression. Simultaneously. While reading. "I wasn't generating fire," he said. "I was just thinking about it. Heat flow." It sort of followed the thought. He turned a page. "I think that's different." "It is different," Fleur said, and her voice had the specific tone she used when something had genuinely surprised her. "It is much more difficult than generation." She looked at Daphne. "Ambient magic conversion." He translated conceptual thought into ambient thermal expression without any framework. "Without even trying," Daphne said. "I can hear you," Harry said mildly. "We know," Daphne said. "We're choosing to discuss you in front of you because you are going to be involved in these conversations whether you like it or not." He looked up from the book. "I don't mind," he said. "It's interesting." He sat up, closing the encyclopedia on his thumb to hold the page. "Can you teach me to do it properly?" Whatever that was but deliberate. This was the thing about Harry's magic that Daphne had been turning over for 3 weeks. It wasn't wild, exactly. Wild magic was chaotic, reactive, unpredictable. His was more like water finding its own level. It took the path of least resistance not because it was weak but because it was efficient, moving toward whatever its current needed without excess. When he learned something conceptually, the magic followed the concept. When he felt something, the magic expressed the feeling. There was no separation between understanding and power, which should have been impossible at 7, should have been impossible at 17, should honestly have been impossible in the theoretical literature Daphne had been quietly raiding from her father's library every evening. "I can try," Fleur said, closing her own book. "Though I want to be honest, what you do is not quite what I do. My magic is," she made the gesture she used when she was reaching for English that her French brain hadn't translated yet, "inherited. Structured by lineage. Yours is structural. It builds itself." She looked at him carefully. "Like architecture that knows what it wants to become." Harry turned this over. "And Daphne's?" "Mine is learned," Daphne said. "Pattern recognition. I study a thing until I understand its logic and then the magic follows the logic." She paused. "It's the least intuitive of the 3, but it's also the most transferable. I can teach what I know because I know how I learned it." "So between you," Harry said, "you have all 3 ways of knowing something." The garden was quiet for a moment, just whine through the hedgerow and the faint smell of singed practice dummy. "Yes," Fleur said. "That is exactly right." Harry nodded, pleased, and opened his book again. "Then teach me everything," he said. "All of it." The education of Harry Potter was not, it turned out, a formal thing. There were no lesson plans. There were no timetables. There was a great deal of sitting in various locations, the Greengrass Manor garden, the library, the long first-floor corridor where the acoustics were good for practicing vocal precision in spell work, the Delacour family's Paris home during the alternate weeks, and the learning happened the way it happened when 3 children who are genuinely interested in the same thing spend time together, sideways, suddenly, through argument and accident and the particular revelations that arrive when you are not looking for them. Harry learned to read magical theory the way he read the Natural Encyclopedia, completely and with absorption, and the theory became practice almost immediately, which initially alarmed Daphne and then became the rhythm she planned around. She'd give him a text in the morning and by afternoon he'd be attempting the practical implication, usually before she'd intended to move there, always with the specific instinct for the essential rather than the peripheral that made him infuriating and remarkable in equal measure. Fleur taught him in a different register entirely. She taught by demonstration, long, unhurried, precise, and her approach assumed that understanding came from watching the thing live before you tried to dissect it. She taught him elemental theory through the actual elements. They stood in the Delacour garden in Paris and she showed him how water moved when asked, how fire breathed, how the air had structure and pressure and intention if you understood what you were touching. Harry watched these demonstrations with a focus that was total, and then he tried them, and the trying was always more than imitation. He understood the why behind the form and the form came out bigger than the original, which Fleur observed with a combination of pride and something she didn't name but which lived in the area of her face that was hardest to control. Daphne observed all of this and took notes. Not because she needed to, precisely, but because note-taking was the way her mind worked, the way she held things in order, and the notes had begun as academic observations and somewhere in the second week had become something else. Less taxonomy. More, a record. The first time Harry laughed, actually laughed, not the polite acknowledgement he'd arrived with but a real one, surprised out of him by something Fleur did with a water charm that went wrong and soaked them both. The first time he argued back in a lesson, not defensively but engaged, genuinely contesting Daphne's reasoning about elemental interdependence with a counterargument that was actually better than her original position. The first time he fell asleep in the library with his head on an open book and his glasses pushed sideways and she'd pulled a blanket from the couch and put it over him without thinking and then stood there for a moment looking at it and then went back to her own reading. She didn't write that one down. Some things were not for records. In the fourth week, Cyrus Greengrass began their political education. He did it carefully, which was how he did everything. Not formally, no summoned to the study moments, no declared curriculum. He would appear when they were in the library or the sitting room and he would begin a conversation, and the conversation would be interesting enough that nobody left, and by the end of it they had covered a piece of wizarding political reality that Daphne suspected was entirely deliberate and had been staged to seem incidental. Harry was a good audience for this. He had no prior assumptions about the political landscape, which meant he asked the questions that people with prior assumptions stopped asking because they thought they already knew the answers. Why does the Ministry want Dumbledore to make decisions? Harry asked, one afternoon in the library, during one of Cyrus's conversational arrivals. He was sitting on the floor again, he preferred the floor, Daphne had stopped questioning it, with 3 books open around him and a quill behind his ear. He's not elected. He's the headmaster of a school. Cyrus settled into the armchair with his tea. Because he is the most powerful wizard alive, he said. Or was, until recently. Until recently, Harry repeated, and it was the flat, factual tone that meant he'd heard the implication and was deciding how to respond to it. You mean me? I mean the bond assessment, Cyrus said. What was registered at Gringotts? He looked at Harry over his tea. Individually, any of you 3 are significant. Together, the Merlin Accords describe the threefold anchor as the most concentrated expression of magical will that the natural world produces. What does that mean practically? Daphne asked, from her desk. It means that when you 3 act in concert, Cyrus said, the magic available to you is not additive. It is multiplicative. Each amplifying the others. He paused. At 7, 9, and 8 years old. The library was quiet. Outside, a late afternoon storm was building over the Wiltshire countryside, and the light had gone the particular gold-green that precedes rain. That's why Dumbledore looks at us like that, Fleur said, from the window seat. Not just at Harry. At all 3. Like we're something that needs to be managed, Daphne said. Yes, Cyrus said. We're not, Harry said. It wasn't a protest. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the same ease he'd used to answer questions at the inquiry. Nobody manages the bond. It isn't a tool. Many people will try to treat it as one, Cyrus said. Let them try, Harry said, and went back to his books. Cyrus looked at Daphne. She met his eyes. He gave her the very small nod that was his version of "this is going well," and stood up and left with his tea, and the library settled back into the quiet of three children doing the work of becoming whatever they were becoming. The letter from Hogwarts arrived during a wandwork session in the Manor's East Courtyard. Not a standard letter, Harry wouldn't receive his Hogwarts letter for 4 more years. This was on thick ministry parchment, Dumbledore's seal, addressed to Harry personally and to the custodial guardians. It requested a meeting. Informal, it specified, in the way that things are specified as informal when the person requesting them wants to control the frame before the meeting happens. Harry read it standing in the courtyard with Fleur's practice wand still in his hand, because they'd been working through basic casting frameworks and Fleur had been letting him borrow it on the theory that the discipline of a channel was worth learning even if he didn't strictly need one. He read the letter twice, then handed it to Daphne. She read it. "He wants to explain himself," she said. "He wants to recalibrate," Fleur said, reading over Daphne's shoulder. "He will acknowledge the mistakes. He will establish that he has thought carefully. And then he will suggest something that sounds reasonable and is actually about maintaining access." "Should I go?" Harry asked. Both girls looked at him. "What do you want?" Daphne asked. Harry turned the borrowed wand in his fingers, end over end, a habit he'd developed that he probably didn't know he had. "I want to hear what he says," he said. "I'm not angry at him. He considered, "I have questions. About my parents. About what happened. He knew them." He looked up. "He's the only person I know of who knew them and isn't dead." There was a weight to this that neither girl tried to diminish. "Then we go," Fleur said simply. "Together," Daphne said. Harry looked at them. "He'll want to speak to me alone." "He can want that," Daphne said. Harry did the thing that was more smile than almost smile now, broader, settling into his face like it belonged there, which it did. "Okay," he said. He looked back at the wand. "Can we finish the session first? I almost had the locking charm." "You had the locking charm," Fleur said, taking the wand back and resetting the practice object at the courtyard's end. "You were overthinking the wrist movement." "I was thinking about the vector." "Don't think about the vector," she said. "Think about the door being closed." She looked at him. "You do this, you analyze the mechanism when the mechanism is not the point. Sometimes magic is not physics. Sometimes it is just intention with permission." "Intention with permission," he repeated. "Feel the difference," she said, and handed the wand back. Harry looked at the practice lock, and the way he looked at it changed, and the charm landed clean and full and the lock turned with a sound like something ancient deciding to cooperate. Fleur put one hand over her mouth briefly. Daphne wrote something in her notes. "Right," Harry said, sounding pleased. "Intention with permission." They met Dumbledore 4 days later at a tea room in Hogsmeade that Cyrus chose, specifically, because it was a Greengrass family property and the proprietor would relay anything relevant back to the manor. This was the kind of thing Daphne appreciated about her father without being entirely comfortable with it. Dumbledore arrived exactly on time, wearing robes of deep blue, his half-moon spectacles freshly polished, his silver beard braided with a restraint that suggested he'd thought about the impression he wanted to make. He sat down across from Harry and looked at the 2 girls seated on either side of him with an expression that processed several things quickly and arrived at a version of gracious acceptance. "Harry," he said. "You look well." "I am well," Harry said. "This is Fleur and Daphne." "We've met," Dumbledore said, with a warmth that was genuine enough to be disarming. "Under somewhat unusual circumstances." "Most circumstances around Harry seem to be unusual," Daphne said pleasantly. Dumbledore's eyes moved to her, and for a moment the twinkle that everyone described was present, but beneath it was something sharper, the eyes of a man doing rapid and sophisticated assessment. Then it passed and the warmth was back. "Miss Greengrass." "Quite so." He looked at Fleur. "Miss Delacour." Your mother is well, I hope. Entirely, Fleur said, in a tone that indicated she knew exactly what the small talk was doing. Dumbledore turned to Harry and paused, and the performance fell away for a moment, entirely, and what was underneath it was something that Daphne found unexpectedly real, an old man looking at a child he had failed and knowing it completely. I owe you an apology, he said. A genuine one, not a political one. I placed you in that house because the protection was real and necessary, and because I allowed myself to believe, that the necessity of the protection excused me from ensuring your welfare within it. That was wrong. It was a failure of my responsibility to you, and I am sorry. Harry looked at him. His hands were flat on the table, calm. I believe you, he said. Dumbledore blinked. I mean that you believe it, Harry said. The apology. I can tell when someone's performing and when they're not. He paused. I'm not saying the sorry makes it fine. But I believe you mean it. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. You are, remarkably like your mother, he said softly. Harry sat with that, something moving behind his eyes that he didn't hide but didn't display either. Will you tell me about her? And Dumbledore, who had come to this meeting with an agenda and a structure and at least 3 strategic objectives that Daphne had identified before the tea arrived, put all of it aside and simply talked. He talked about Lily Evans, her laugh, her temper, the particular way she'd understood magic as a language that wanted to be spoken rather than commanded. He talked about James Potter, reckless, loyal, funnier than anyone admitted now that he was a symbol rather than a person. He talked about them together, the way some people find the full version of themselves only alongside another person, and as he talked his voice went quieter and more honest and the tea room fell away. Harry listened. He didn't take notes, didn't ask clarifying questions, just took it in, all of it, storing it in the careful interior architecture of a child who had never had enough and was learning what it felt like to receive something without checking first whether it would be taken back. Fleur's hand moved on the table, not quite reaching Harry's but close, and she stopped herself, and Daphne noticed the stop and said nothing. When Dumbledore finished there was a long, comfortable silence. Then Harry said, You want to be involved? In my education? In what comes next? Dumbledore looked at him. Yes, he said. Why should I say yes? Harry asked. Not hostile. Genuinely asking, the way he asked his father's questions, working out the logic. Because I know things that will protect you, Dumbledore said. About Voldemort's return, and he will return, Harry, I am certain of it. About the nature of what happened on the night your parents died. About what you carry and what it means. He held Harry's gaze steadily. And because I made mistakes that hurt you, and I would like the opportunity to do differently. Harry looked at Daphne. She gave him nothing, no signal, no suggestion, because this was his. Then he looked at Fleur, who also held neutral. His call. Okay, Harry said. But I decide how involved. Not you. He looked at Dumbledore. You don't get to make decisions about me and tell me later. If you know something relevant to my life, you tell me. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. That is a fair condition, he said. I accept it. Good, Harry said. He picked up his tea. Tell me about Voldemort. Dumbledore looked, briefly, startled. Now? You said you know things that will protect me, Harry said. Start with those. He looked at Dumbledore over his cup. I'd rather know than not know. So Dumbledore told him. Not everything, some things he held back, and Daphne noted which ones, logged them, because the silences in what an intelligent person says are as informative as the words, but more than he'd probably planned to. More than he'd told anyone Harry's age. He talked about Horcruxes in terms abstract enough to maintain deniability, about the prophecy's existence without its specific content, about the necessity of Harry understanding his own power not as a weapon but as a foundation. Harry listened, Ask 3 questions that cut to the center of each topic so precisely that Dumbledore paused before answering each time, and at the end of it nodded with the air of someone who has filed a great deal away for later processing. "Thank you," he said. "I should be thanking you," Dumbledore said. "For your openness. Given everything." "I'm not open about everything," Harry said. "But this seemed worth being open about." He looked at Fleur and Daphne. "We'll talk about the rest later." Dumbledore's eyes moved between the 3 of them, and Daphne saw him update his model, saw him truly see for the first time what they were together rather than separately, not 3 children with a magical bond recorded on Gringotts parchment but something that was already operating with the integrated intelligence that the bond made possible, 3 different ways of knowing working in concert, already, at 7 and 8 and 9 years old. The calculation behind his eyes shifted. She watched it shift. He had come here to manage the situation and he was leaving having understood that the situation was already well beyond managing, and unlike Cyrus Greengrass who'd arrived at that conclusion with pragmatic acceptance, Dumbledore arrived at it with something more complex, relief mixed with caution mixed with the specific discomfort of a man who is used to being the most intelligent person in the room discovering he is not, quite, in this one. He stood, gathered his robes, and said, very quietly, "Your parents would be so proud of you, Harry." Harry looked at the table for a moment. Then looked up. "I hope so," he said. Dumbledore left. The tea room let out its held breath. Outside, the Hogsmeade afternoon was fully underway, witches and wizards moving past the windows, and the world looked exactly as it had an hour ago except that it wasn't. Harry drank the rest of his tea. Set the cup down. "He's still keeping something back," he said. "2 things, Daphne said. The specific content of the prophecy, and something about the night your parents died that he thinks you're not ready for." "I know about the prophecy," Harry said. Both girls looked at him. "Not the words," he said. "But Griphook mentioned it in Gringotts. In the Heritage Room. He said there was a prophetic record tied to my lineage." He tilted his head slightly. "I didn't push it because I wasn't sure I wanted to know yet." A pause. "I'm still not sure. But I know it exists." Daphne looked at her notes. Added a line. "And the other thing?" Harry was quiet for a moment. He was looking at his hands, the ones that could see colors. "Something about the night has more to it than a protection ward," he said. The way he talked around it, the gaps were too deliberate. "There's something specific about how Voldemort, about what happened to him. Why he didn't die." He looked up. "I think it might be about me." The afternoon light came through the tea room windows and settled on the table between them, warm and specific, and none of them spoke for a moment. "We'll find out," Fleur said. "When you're ready," Daphne said. Harry nodded. He picked up the practice wand that Fleur had lent him again. He'd taken to carrying it, not because he needed it but because the discipline of having a focal point was useful, Fleur had said so, and turned it end over end in his fingers, that familiar unconscious habit. And outside the window Hogsmeade moved and breathed and was entirely unaware that inside this tea room 3 children had just quietly renegotiated the terms of the next decade. That evening in the Greengrass Manor library, after dinner and after Cyrus had come and gone with his conversational curriculum and after Apollon had flood to confirm travel arrangements for the following week's Paris rotation, Daphne found Harry standing in front of the tall window at the library's end, looking out at the darkened garden. She'd come back for her notes, left on the reading desk. She almost didn't speak, almost took the notes and left, but something in the quality of how he was standing stopped her. "Okay?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "He described my mother laughing," he said. "What it sounded like." He didn't turn from the window. "I've been trying to, it's stupid." "What?" "I've been trying to remember if I remember it," he said. The laugh. "I was one when she died. I know I don't remember. But I keep trying." He touched the window glass with 2 fingers, lightly. "Is that stupid?" No, Daphne said. It doesn't make logical sense. Most things that matter don't, she said. She came to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the dark garden, at the shapes of the hedgerows and the practice dummy, replaced now, unscorched, standing pale in the moonlight. The trying is the point, I think. Not the remembering. Harry looked at the garden. She sounded like someone who meant it, he said. That's what he said. That when she laughed it was because she actually found something funny, not because it was expected. He paused. I like that. Me too, Daphne said. Fleur appeared in the library doorway, in her dressing gown, her silver hair loose, holding 3 cups of something hot. She looked at the two of them at the window and didn't comment on the quality of the silence she'd walked into, just crossed the room and handed them each a cup. Cocoa, she said. The Paris kitchen sends it. It is better than English cocoa. Nothing is better than English cocoa, Daphne said automatically. This is, Fleur said, and sat on the window seat, tucking her feet underneath her. Harry tried it. His expression was the best argument either of them could have made. Okay, he said. It's better. Obviously, Fleur said. They stood and sat there in the library, with the dark garden outside and the warm light inside and the cups of too good cocoa, and nobody said anything for a while, and it was the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have decided, without ceremony or announcement, that they are safe with each other. At some point Harry said, I set another book on fire today, and Fleur said, I know, I was there, you need to regulate the ambient output when you're emotionally engaged, and Daphne said, I've written 12 pages of notes on exactly that problem, and Harry laughed, the real one, and the library held it. Outside, Magical Britain was busy with its ongoing commentary, its bets and its gossip and its opinion pieces in the Prophet about the unprecedented threefold anchor and its implications for the political balance of power and the custody arrangements legality and 17 other concerns that were all, in one way or another, about the 3 of them. Inside, there was just the window and the garden and the cocoa and the quiet, and it was more than enough. Chapter 5, The Gambit. The contract arrived on a Thursday morning in August, 6 weeks after the inquiry. It came by formal owl, a large, serious bird with ministry certification rings on both legs, the kind used exclusively for legal documents, and it landed on the Greengrass Manor breakfast table between the toast rack and Daphne's morning notes with a weight that went beyond its physical dimensions. The seal was Greengrass family crest. The sender was Cyrus Greengrass, who was sitting at the other end of the table. He had written it himself, sent it formally through the family's legal owl, and was now drinking his tea and looking at the garden through the tall breakfast room windows with the studied neutrality of a man who has done something he considers necessary and is waiting to see how the room receives it. Harry picked up the contract first, because he was closest and because his instinct for significant objects in a room had become, over the weeks, something genuinely remarkable. He turned it over in his hands, looked at the seal, and set it flat on the table in front of him without opening it. What is it? He asked. Open it, Cyrus said, to his tea. Harry broke the seal. Unfolded the parchment. Read it with the focused, unhurried attention he gave everything, his lips moving faintly on the longer legal phrases, his face giving nothing. He reached the end. Set it down. He looked at Cyrus. It's a betrothal contract, he said. Between me and Daphne. The breakfast room was very quiet. Daphne had gone still in the way she went still when something required absolute precision, the stillness of someone who has enormous amounts of energy and is directing all of it into control. She hadn't looked at the contract. She was looking at her father. It's preliminary, Cyrus said. He finally turned from the window, his expression measured, his voice even. A letter of intent, formally speaking. Not binding without Harry's signature, not enforceable without the counter-signature of a custodial guardian, which is you, Daphne said. Her voice was very calm. This was the voice she used in the bottom of anger, when the emotion had passed through heat and arrived at something cold and exact. You would be signing for both parties. Since Harry's custodial guardians are, among other people, you. It creates a formal legal structure, Cyrus said. Which, given the public attention on the bond, given the political pressure from at least 4 families I can name who are already exploring ways to attach themselves to Harry's lineage through alliance or contract, it would give the Greengrass family precedence, Harry said. Cyrus looked at him. Yes, he said. Among other things. Among other things, Harry repeated. He picked up the contract again and looked at it. Then he looked at Daphne. Something moved between them, quiet and direct, and Daphne felt it through the bond not as a message but as a question. He was checking, not asking her what to do, but checking whether she was all right, whether she needed anything from him before this conversation went where it was going. She gave him the smallest nod. I'm fine. Go. Harry set the contract back down. He folded his hands on the table in a gesture that Daphne recognized because she'd seen it on her father 100 times, the gesture of someone who is about to say something that requires the table to be clear between them. I like Daphne, Harry said. A lot. She's one of the 2 best people I've ever met, which isn't a large sample, but I think the quality is more important than the size. He looked at Cyrus steadily. If I ever decide I want to be with Daphne in the way this contract means, I'll do it because I chose it. Not because it's filed somewhere. Cyrus held Harry's gaze. You're 7 years old, he said. Yes, Harry said. Which means anything in this contract would take effect years from now, when I'm old enough for it to be real. Which means the only purpose it serves right now is legal and political. He tilted his head slightly. And I understand why you want that. I understand the 4 families. I understand the precedents. He paused. But the answer is no. The breakfast room was still. Outside, a wood pigeon made an opinion known in the hedgerow and then went quiet. Cyrus looked at his daughter. Daphne met his eyes, and for the first time in the conversation she had a clear read on him, not the political surface but the thing underneath it, and what she found surprised her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't calculating his next move. He was watching her with an expression that was, quietly, an apology. He had made the move. He had known it might fail. He had made it anyway because it was the move his position required, and now he was sitting with what it cost. You should have talked to me, Daphne said. Quietly, without heat. Before you sent it. Yes, he said. Because it matters what I think. Yes, he said again, and this time the word was different, carrying something more, the acknowledgement of a man who raised his daughter to be exactly this and is encountering the full weight of that fact at close range. You're right. I should have. Daphne looked at the contract. Then she picked it up, folded it neatly along its original crease, and handed it back to her father across the table. No, she said. Cyrus took it. He held it for a moment, looking at it, and then set it beside his tea with the careful deliberateness of a man filing something away. Understood, he said. The pigeon in the hedgerow made its opinion known again. Harry reached for the toast. What Cyrus had said about the 4 families was not, it turned out, the full number. It was closer to 7, and by the following Tuesday they were all making their presence known through various channels, formal inquiries to the Greengrass solicitors, oblique social overtures to the Delacour family's English contacts, one spectacularly ill-judged owl to Harry directly from a family Daphne identified as the Parkinsons, offering what it described as a formal introduction to our daughter Pansy, aged 7, with a view toward, Harry had read that one aloud at lunch, and both girls had reacted so differently that the contrast was almost comedic, Fleur with a cold silence that communicated extensive displeasure, Daphne with a very short sentence about the Parkinson family's historical tendency toward overreach that was technically informational and effectively devastating. Harry had folded it up and used it as a bookmark. What do I do about these? He asked. Nothing, Daphne said. The bond is on public record. Any contract that contradicts a Merlin Accord recognized bond is void. They know this. The owls aren't legal moves, they're positioning. They want it known that they tried. So they can say later that they had an early relationship, Harry said. Exactly. That's exhausting, Harry said. Welcome to Wizarding Britain, Daphne said. It is entirely exhausting and it never stops. But the Parkinson owl and its siblings were background noise compared to what arrived on Wednesday evening, a Patronus from Fleur Delacour, a silver swallow that came through the manor wards with the urgency of someone who had been waiting until they were certain before acting. It materialized in the library where all three of them were working and said, in Apollin's voice, precise and quick, "Cyrus, there is a ministry delegation forming. Fudge's office. They intend to propose a formal guardianship resolution through the Wisengamot that would assign primary custody to neither of our families but to a ministry-appointed educational board. They are calling it a protective educational mandate. I am coming through in the morning. Do not respond to anything before I arrive." The silver swallow dissolved. The library was quiet. A protective educational mandate, Daphne said. Which would give the ministry control, Fleur said. Which would give Fudge's office control, Daphne corrected. Which is meaningfully different. She looked at Harry. Cornelius Fudge is the Minister for Magic. He is not unintelligent but he is extremely sensitive to political pressure, which means whoever is applying pressure on him currently is the actual problem. She paused, working through it. The four families. Plus whoever else has decided that if they can't attach themselves directly to Harry they'd rather nobody did. Harry was sitting on the floor with his back against the bookshelves, and he'd stopped pretending to read some time ago. He was listening with the quality of attention he brought to combat situations, or what she imagined combat situations would look like for Harry, focused and absolutely still, the magic around him that she couldn't see but could feel like pressure along the inside of her sternum, gathering without being called. What does the mandate do, specifically? He asked. Removes our family's custodial standing, Daphne said. Establishes a board, ministry appointed, which means politically appointed, as the authority over Harry's residence, education, social contact. She held his gaze. Contact with us would be subject to board approval. Harry was quiet for a moment. They want to separate us, he said. They want control over you, Daphne said. Separating us is the method. Can they do it? Legally? Given the bond? The bond complicates it significantly, Daphne said. But the ministry has motivated lawyers. And Fudge's office has political will. They could tie it up in Wisengamot procedure for years, and in the meantime Harry lives, where? Under the mandate, pending resolution. She looked at Fleur. That's the real move. Not winning the legal argument. Making the legal argument last long enough that interim arrangements become permanent by default. Fleur had been standing at the library window since the Patronus arrived, her arms crossed, her silver hair catching the lamplight. She hadn't moved or spoken, and Daphne had learned over the weeks to read Fleur's stillness the way she read her father's. It wasn't absence, it was the visible surface of very rapid interior activity. She was thinking. Hard. My mother said do not respond before she arrives, Fleur said, still looking at the window. Right, Daphne said. She did not say do not think, Fleur said, and turned from the window. Apollon arrived at 7 in the morning and Cyrus was already in the study, which meant he'd been there for some time and the tea on the desk was the second pot. Daphne had been up since 6, her notes from the previous evening reorganized twice, and she'd brought Harry and Fleur because there was no version of this conversation that didn't include them. They sat along the study's far wall on the long settle, Harry in the middle, as always, and the adults occupied the desk and the chairs opposite, and the morning came through the windows gray and purposeful. Apollon had brought documents. She spread them across the desk with the efficient authority of someone who had spent the night working and intended the evidence of that work to be visible. The mandate proposal was drafted 3 days ago, she said. Which means it was commissioned before the Parkinson owl and before whatever other moves happened this week. This is not reactive. Someone has been planning this since the inquiry. Lucius Malfoy, Cyrus said. Daphne looked up sharply. His wife was at the inquiry, Cyrus said. Narcissa. Remember. He looked at the documents. She was watching. Not participating, watching. Lucius wasn't there himself, which is the tell. He sent her to assess. He looked at Apollon. The mandate proposal goes through the Wiesengemot. Lucius has 6 reliable votes. If Fudge is already aligned, that's enough to open the procedure. Why? Harry asked, from the settle. Everyone looked at him. Why does Malfoy want this? He said. What does he get? Cyrus looked at his daughter, and Daphne understood the look. Answer him. Lucius Malfoy was a Death Eater, Daphne said. He claims he acted under the Imperius Curse. The Ministry accepted this. He is currently one of the most politically influential figures in Wizarding Britain. She looked at Harry directly. You are the person who ended Voldemort. Voldemort, whose inner circle Malfoy belonged to. If you come into your full power and position and you are independent and guided by people who have no interest in accommodating his political position, I'm a threat to him, Harry said. You're a threat to everything he's built since 1981, Daphne said. The moment you're an adult and free and powerful and unmanageable, everything that depends on the current political balance is at risk. Harry was quiet, turning this over, the end-over-end thought process that she'd come to recognize as his version of what she did with a quill and parchment. So he wants the ministry board because he can influence the board, he said. And he wants to separate us because we 3 together are harder to manage than just me alone. Yes, Cyrus said. He said it the way he'd said it to Harry at the inquiry, straight, adult to adult, no softening. And Dumbledore? Fleur asked. What does he do while this is happening? That, Apollon said, is the most important question. She looked at the documents. Dumbledore opposes the mandate, I believe. His interest is in being the primary influence in Harry's life himself. A ministry board removes him as well. But his opposition is complicated by the fact that he cannot publicly support our custodial arrangement without implicitly endorsing the decision to remove Harry from the Dursleys, which he placed Harry with in the first place, Daphne finished. So supporting us means admitting the original placement was wrong. He's already admitted it, Harry said. Privately, Daphne said. To us. In a tea room in Hogsmeade with no witnesses but 3 children. She paused. That's different from doing it in front of the Wiesengemot. The study was quiet for a moment. Outside, the grey morning was brightening. Right, Harry said. He stood up from the settle. He was wearing his own clothes now, properly his, bought with the vault funds that Gringotts had released as part of the Heritage Resolution, and the difference between those clothes and the Dursleys' cast-offs was a physical fact in every room he walked into. He stood in the middle of the study, hands in his pockets, and looked at the adults and then at Daphne and then at Fleur, and something in his face had settled into a clarity that Daphne found, every time she saw it, slightly breathtaking. What do we do? The Wiesengemot hearing is in 2 days, Apollon said. The mandate proposal will be put formally. Can we stop it before the hearing? Fleur asked. We'd need Lucius Malfoy's 6 votes to break, Cyrus said. Or we'd need the procedure challenged on the grounds that the bond assessment makes it legally void, but that argument requires a precedent that doesn't exist, because the bond hasn't been active before, and writing new legal precedent takes months. Months we don't have, Daphne said. We need Dumbledore, Harry said. Everyone looked at him. Not to win the hearing, Harry said. To break the votes before we get there. If Dumbledore publicly endorses the current arrangement, our arrangement, before the hearing, Lucius loses at least 3 of his 6 because nobody in the moderate bloc is going to vote against Dumbledore publicly. He looked at Cyrus. That's right, isn't it? Cyrus had the expression he got when his daughter did something with a chess piece that he hadn't anticipated. Daphne recognized it because he was wearing it looking at Harry instead of her. "It's right," he said. "But Dumbledore's endorsement requires him to admit he was wrong publicly," Harry said. "Yes. I know." A pause. "I'll ask him." The study was very quiet. "Harry," Apollon said carefully. "What you are describing is asking an old man to do something difficult," Harry said. "That's all." He looked at Apollon, and the steadiness in his face was complete without being cold. "He told me he wants to do differently." I believed him. This is the first test of whether he meant it. He looked at Daphne. "Do you think he meant it?" Daphne thought about the tea room. About Dumbledore's face when the performance fell away and the old man underneath it looked at Harry and said, "I owe you an apology." About the specific quality of genuine shame, which was not a thing that could be faked because it required the person experiencing it to already know what the right thing was. "Yes," she said. "I think he meant it." Harry nodded. "Then I'll go today." Fleur went with him. This was not a discussion, she simply stood up when he did and that was that, and Daphne stayed behind because someone needed to be in the manor working through the legal architecture with Cyrus and Apollon, and also because she understood, in the way she was coming to understand the particular grammar of the three of them, that this was a Fleur and Harry moment. The way some things were Daphne and Harry moments and some were all three and some were all three plus the specific magic of being. The bond together. She watched them leave from the study window, Harry and Fleur walking down the manor drive toward the apparition point, Fleur's silver hair bright against the morning and Harry slightly shorter beside her, and she noted, because she noted everything, that they were walking in step without trying to. Then she turned back to the parchment and the work. The message that came back at noon was not a Patronus or an owl. It was Harry and Fleur themselves, coming back through the flue in the library, and the quality of their arrival communicated something before either of them spoke, not triumph, exactly, but the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing resolved. Fleur's expression was thoughtful and slightly wondering. Harry looked like himself, which meant he looked fine, which Daphne had come to understand meant things had gone approximately as planned. "He said yes," Harry said. "What did you say to him?" Daphne asked. "I said what you said," Harry told her. "That he already told me the truth in the tea room. That this was the same truth in a bigger room. He sat down on the library floor, his preferred location in any library he'd encountered. He cried a bit." "Oh," Daphne said. "Not a lot," Harry said. "Just a bit." "And then he said yes." Fleur sat on the window seat and tucked her feet underneath her and said, very quietly, "He said something else." Harry looked at her. Something passed between them, and Daphne held her question, let the moment be what it was. "He told Harry about the prophecy," Fleur said. "The full content." The library was still. Outside, the August afternoon was warm and slow, bees in the garden, the distant sound of Cyrus's study window opened somewhere above. "Harry," Daphne said. "I'm all right," Harry said. He was looking at the bookshelf in front of him, not at anything specific, just looking. It's a lot. But I'm all right." He paused. "It says neither can live while the other survives. Me and Voldemort." Another pause. "Which means he has to come back. For it to end." Daphne didn't say anything. The silence was the right thing. "And I have to be the one," Harry said. "When he does." He turned his head and looked at both of them, and there was nothing broken in his expression, nothing performing bravery, just the same clarity he brought to everything. "But not alone," he said. "The prophecy is about me and him. It's not about just me." "No," Fleur said. "It is not." "No," Daphne said. Harry nodded. He looked back at the bookshelf. A moment passed. Then he said, "Can we do wand work this afternoon?" I want to work on the shielding sequence. The one where the intention has to hold under external pressure. Fleur looked at Daphne. Daphne looked at Fleur. Yes, Fleur said. We can do that. Dumbledore's public statement appeared in the Evening Prophet that same day, timed for the late edition in the way that significant public statements were timed when they were meant to land before morning and give people the night to absorb them. It was, characteristically, beautifully written. It acknowledged the original placement directly, without euphemism. The word wrong appeared 3 times, each time doing different work, carrying different weight. It described the threefold anchor bond in terms that were both technically accurate and genuinely moving, which was a difficult combination that he managed because he was, whatever else was true, an extraordinary writer. And it endorsed, clearly and without qualification, the current custodial arrangement under the Greengrass and Delacour families as the appropriate and correct home for Harry Potter. By morning, 3 of Lucius Malfoy's 6 votes had sent formal notices of abstention to the Wisengamot. By afternoon, 2 more had followed. The protective educational mandate proposal reached the hearing with 1 supporter, Lucius Malfoy himself, who presented it in front of a Wisengamot chamber that was significantly less receptive than it had been 2 days prior, with the particular composed fury of a man who knows he has been outmaneuvered and intends to make sure everyone in the room understands the cost of that for future reference. He made an excellent argument. Daphne, sitting in the gallery, acknowledged this privately. His reasoning was tight, his legal citations precise, his framing of the Ministry Board as a neutral, apolitical solution genuinely persuasive in the abstract. He was, stripped of the context of what he was actually doing and why, the best speaker in the room. He lost anyway, 14 votes to 9, because Dumbledore was at the bench and Amelia Bones was in the chair and the public statement had done its work in the overnight hours. When the vote was called, Daphne watched Lucius Malfoy's face and learned something about him that she filed away carefully. He didn't look angry. He looked at Harry, who was sitting in the gallery between Fleur and Daphne, where neither he nor the girls technically needed to be, but Cyrus had decided their presence was strategic and they'd agreed, and Lucius looked at Harry with an expression that was not anger and not contempt. It was assessment. Recalibration. The expression of a very intelligent man who has just updated his model and is already building the next one. Harry met his gaze. He didn't look away, didn't shift, just looked back at Lucius Malfoy the way he looked at everyone, with that steady, direct, unhurried attention, and Lucius held it for 3 seconds and then looked at the chamber floor. He'll try something else, Harry said quietly, for only Daphne and Fleur to hear. Yes, Daphne said. Something we won't see as clearly, Harry said. Probably, Daphne said. We'll handle it when it comes. Harry nodded, settled back in his seat, and watched Madame Bones close the proceedings with the clean efficiency of someone who has better things to do. That evening, 3 things happened. The first was that Cyrus Greengrass came to the library after dinner and sat across from his daughter and said, without preamble, "You were right about the contract. What I should have said is that I'm proud of you. I am. Very." He paused. I should say it more. Daphne looked at him for a moment. You can practice, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I intend to, he said, and left. The second was that Apollon found Fleur in the Paris-style sitting room that the manor had given over to the Delacour family's use during rotation weeks, and she sat beside her daughter on the velvet settee and put her arm around her without saying anything, and Fleur leaned into it in the way she only leaned into things when she wasn't performing anything, and Apollon pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's silver head and they stayed like that for a while. The third was the simplest. Harry was in the garden after dark, sitting on the grass near where the practice dummy stood, looking up. The August sky was clear, the stars doing what stars did over the Wiltshire countryside when there was no light competition, being enormous and close and almost aggressively present. Daphne came out because she couldn't sleep. Fleur came out because she'd seen from her window that Harry was in the garden and she'd brought her dressing gown and 2 extra blankets. They sat down on either side of him without a word about it, and Fleur distributed the blankets, and Harry said, "There's the Pleiades," and pointed, and Daphne said, "The Seven Sisters," and Fleur said, "In French we call them les Pleiades, which is the same but sounds better," and Harry said, "Everything sounds better in French," and Fleur made a sound of vindicated satisfaction, and Daphne said, "Don't tell her that, she'll be unbearable," and Harry laughed. They lay back on the grass, all three, looking up at the stars, the blankets overlapping, the garden quiet around them, the bond present between them the way warmth is present in a room, not something you point at but something you know is there because of what the room feels like without it. "Daphne," Harry said, after a while. Thank you for coming to Privet Drive." She looked at the stars. "You would have been found eventually." "Maybe," he said. "But not that day." A pause. "Not by you too." The night was warm and the stars were doing their enormous patient thing, and somewhere in the hedgerow something small was moving through the undergrowth, and the bond held all three of them in the particular way it held things, not tight, not possessive, but present and sure, like a compass that doesn't point north but points toward wherever you need to go. "Fleur," Harry said. "Yes?" "Thank you for sitting next to me in the cupboard." Fleur was quiet for a moment. "You are welcome," she said, and the words were soft and real and entirely unarmored. The garden held them. Above, the Pleiades burned their patient ancient light across the sky, and the night moved, slow and full, and none of them went inside for a very long time. Chapter 6. The choosing September arrived the way it always did in southern England, without announcement, the heat simply gone one morning, replaced by something cooler and sharper that smelled of turning leaves and the particular clarity that autumn air carried before it committed to being cold. Harry noticed it the moment he stepped into the Greengrass Manor garden at 6 in the morning, earlier than anyone else, which had become his habit over the weeks. He stood on the grass in his socks with his hands in his pockets and breathed it in, this new air, and something in the quality of the morning felt like a marker, before and after, a turning point that the world was noting even if he hadn't yet decided what it meant. He'd been having the dream again. Not a nightmare, exactly. More like a memory that didn't belong to him, green light, a woman's voice saying his name, and then a sound that was also a feeling, the sensation of something very large and very dark hitting something very small and simply stopping, like a wave that reaches a wall and falls back. He always woke from it feeling strange, not frightened but displaced, like he'd been somewhere very far away and the return journey took longer than the night. He knew what it was now. Dumbledore had given him enough to understand the shape of it, even if the full picture was still years away from being necessary to look at directly. He kept that knowledge in the same place he kept the prophecy, not buried, not ignored, but stored carefully, because there was a difference between knowing a thing and being ready to act on it, and he was 7 years old and he had time and the people around him had made it abundantly clear that they intended to use that time well. He heard the garden door open behind him and didn't turn around. The footsteps were Daphne's. She'd had a growth spurt in August and her stride was slightly longer than it had been in July, and she placed her feet with the particular deliberateness of someone who had learned to move without making noise but wasn't always trying to. She came to stand beside him, and they both looked at the garden for a moment. "You're up early," she said. "So are you." "I was working," she said. "You were dreaming." He looked at her. "How did you know?" She looked straight ahead. "The bond," she said simply. "When you dream that dream, I can feel it. Not the content, just the quality of it. Like a room that's had a fire in it." She paused. "Fleur feels it too." Harry turned this over. He wasn't uncomfortable with it. The bond had become as natural to him as the color of magic, something he'd always been able to perceive and had simply not had context for until now. "Does it wake you?" he asked. "Sometimes." "Sorry." "Don't be," she said, with a firmness that closed the apology without dismissing it. She tucked her hands into the sleeves of her robe against the morning cool. "I'd rather know." They stood in the garden and the September morning moved around them, and somewhere above in the manor Fleur was probably awake too, and the three-part thing that lived between them was present and quiet and solid, and Harry thought, not for the first time but with new specificity, about what it meant to have people who felt the shape of your worst nights from the inside. "Something's happening today," he said. "Yes," Daphne said. "Several things. The first thing was the Dursleys." Madame Bones's formal censure had spent 6 weeks moving through the bureaucratic machinery of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, acquiring signatures and supplementary reports and the particular institutional momentum of a process that nobody was trying to stop. This morning it had arrived at its conclusion, a formal legal determination regarding the treatment of a minor in wizarding custody, with findings and prescribed remedies. Cyrus had received the summary owl at breakfast and read it twice and then passed it to Apollon without comment. Apollon read it and set it down and said, "That is appropriate," in a tone that was the conclusion of a very long sentence she'd been composing since the afternoon she'd pushed up Harry's sleeve in the leaky cauldron parlor. Harry read it third. The language was formal and legal and dense, but the substance was plain. The ministry had determined that the conditions of his previous placement constituted actionable neglect, that the custodial conduct of Vernon and Petunia Dursley had failed every applicable standard of care, and that accordingly they were henceforth barred from any role in the care of magical minors, subject to ongoing monitoring, and formally required to appear before a ministry welfare panel within 30 days. It wasn't Azkaban. Harry had understood it wouldn't be Azkaban. The law was precise about the threshold for criminal prosecution, and the Dursleys existed, unfortunately, on the wrong side of that line. What it was consequences. Official, documented, impossible to quietly make disappear. Their names on a ministry record that would not be sealed. He read the summary and folded it and handed it back to Cyrus and said, "Okay," and ate his toast, and that was that. Fleur watched him across the table. He could feel her watching. He didn't look up because if he looked up he was going to have to be articulate about something he wasn't ready to be articulate about, which was the specific complicated texture of finding out that something has been officially acknowledged as wrong and discovering that acknowledgement doesn't fix it but also isn't nothing, and the two things sitting together in his chest like objects of different temperatures. Under the table, something touched his hand. He looked down. Fleur's hand, just resting against his knuckles, not holding, just present. He looked up. She wasn't looking at him. She was reading the Morning Prophet with the focused frown she used for anything written by Rita Skeeter. But her hand stayed where it was. He turned his hand over and she let him and they ate breakfast like that, reading and eating and not making anything of it, and the morning moved around them and Cyrus talked to Apollon about the warding specialist's report and Daphne made notes and nobody commented, and it was the most ordinary extraordinary thing Harry could remember. The second thing was the ward work. The warding specialist Madame Bones had appointed was a witch named Emmeline Vance, spare and precise and possessed of the particular professional intensity of someone who had spent 30 years doing one thing very well and had opinions about it. She arrived at the manor at 10, set up her instruments in the east courtyard with the economical efficiency of someone who'd done this setup 1,000 times, and looked at Harry with the same assessing quality that most competent people looked at him with now, not the blankness of someone seeing the famous name, but the focus of someone looking at a specific and interesting problem. "The blood ward has decayed," she said, to the group assembled in the courtyard. She had a device like a compass that was turning steadily and giving readings in a notation that Daphne was probably already decoding. As expected, given the severance of residential proximity. But the underlying magical signature it was anchored to, the sacrificial protection, that hasn't decayed. She looked at Harry. "It's transferred." "To what?" Cyrus asked. Vance looked at Harry. Then at Fleur. Then at Daphne. Her compass device was turning faster now, its needle moving between the three of them with the insistent pattern of something that had found what it was looking for. "To the bond," she said. "The sacrificial magic has integrated with the threefold anchor. Which is," she paused, consulting the device, "not something I've seen before. Not something anyone's seen before, technically. But the mechanism is sound. The sacrificial protection was never about the location or the blood relative, specifically, it was about love freely given in extremity. The anchor bond has an analogous foundational quality. Love freely given, Harry said. In the old magical texts, the sacrificial principle requires a specific kind of freely given, unconditional bond, Vance said, in the careful tone of someone who is being precise because precision matters here. What your mother created was unique because the love was absolute and unbounded and the sacrifice was completely willing. The anchor bond, in the record's blood right shared with me, she looked at the compass, has the same signature. She looked at the three of them. Whatever it is between you three, it's the same quality. Magically speaking. The courtyard was very still. So he is protected, Apollon said. As long as the bond is intact and the three parties are living, Vance said. More strongly than the original ward, because the original ward was static and this is dynamic. It grows. She clicked the compass closed. I wouldn't worry about Voldemort finding a clear shot any time soon. Harry looked at Fleur. Fleur looked at Daphne. Daphne looked at Harry. None of them said anything. But the bond did what it did, that warm, resonant pulse, the three-part thing confirming itself, like a tuning fork finding its note. Right, Harry said. Good. The third thing was the one nobody had planned. It arrived in the form of a large barn owl at 11:30, while Vance was completing her supplementary ward work around the manor perimeter and the three children were in the library. The owl was enormous and self-important, the kind that the wealthiest wizarding families used for formal correspondence. Its leg bore a sealed tube of heavy parchment with the Malfoy crest pressed into dark green wax. Harry picked it out of the air when it came through the library window, wandlessly, without looking up from the book he'd been reading, his hand simply rising at the right moment, and the owl looked affronted at this departure from normal perching protocol but submitted to having its tube removed and departed. Harry turned the tube over in his fingers. The green wax seal. The crest. Open it, Daphne said, from her desk. He broke the seal and extracted the parchment. He read it once, quickly, and then read it again more slowly, and then set it flat on the floor in front of him and looked at it the way he looked at things that required the additional distance of a wider view. Read it out, Fleur said. She'd come off the window seat and was standing now. Mr. Potter, Harry read. I write to you directly and without intermediary because I believe you are best served by directness, whatever other impressions recent events may have created. I oppose the current arrangement not from malice toward you but from a considered position regarding the stability of Wizarding Britain, which I believe requires careful stewardship at this particular moment. I was overruled. I accept this. What I write to propose now is not a legal or political instrument, simply a meeting between two parties who share a significant interest in the future of our world. I believe we have more to discuss than the current adversarial framing of our acquaintance suggests. I ask only an hour of your time, at a location of your choosing, at your convenience. I remain, with respect, Lucius Malfoy. The library was quiet when he finished. Daphne had her quill in her hand and wasn't writing. Fleur had her arms crossed, not closed off but thinking, the contained energy stillness. Harry was looking at the letter. No, Fleur said. Not immediately, Daphne said. But the letter is interesting. What's interesting about it is that he sent it at all, Harry said. He picked the letter up and folded it carefully. He knows he lost the Wisengamot vote. He knows the mandate is dead. He knows the censure on the Dursleys closes the last avenue for challenging the custody arrangement. He looked at the folded letter. So why is he extending his hand? Because he's intelligent, Daphne said. He knows the current situation is what it is. Fighting it costs him more than accepting it. So he's repositioning, from adversary to, she paused, something else. Something with more access and less risk. He wants to be in the room when things happen, Harry said. Yes, Daphne said. Should we let him? Both girls looked at him. Not now, Daphne said. Not for years, probably. But, she was working through it in real time, her ice blue mind doing its thing. Having an intelligent adversary who thinks he's moving toward accommodation is more useful than having one who knows he's opposing you. In the long term. You want to leave the door open, Harry said. I want to decide later, she said. From a position of more information. She looked at the letter. He's right that he wrote directly and without intermediary. That's not nothing. A pause. Send a reply that's civil and non-committal. Keep the option. Harry looked at Fleur. What do you think? Fleur unfolded her arms. I think he is a man who does everything for reasons, she said. And I think his reason for this letter is that he has looked at what we three did in 6 weeks, the inquiry, the mandate, Dumbledore's statement, and he has decided that being against us is the wrong side to be on. She paused. Which means we have already won something we did not know we were competing for. Harry turned this over. His respect, he said. His calculation, Daphne said. Both, Fleur said. Harry nodded once. Okay. Civil and non-committal. He set the letter aside with the decisive finality of something filed for later. What else is happening today? What happened next was not on anyone's list. It started in the afternoon, when all three of them were in the east courtyard finishing the day's wand work. Harry had graduated from borrowed wands and Cyrus had arranged, through a contact at Ollivander's, for a temporary trial selection, a box of 12 wands to try before the formal fitting later in the year. Harry had been working through them methodically, finding most of them merely functional and one of them almost right but not quite, like a word in a language that isn't your first. He was holding the 11th wand, Holly, 11 inches, a core that Daphne had noted was listed as phoenix feather, when it happened. He didn't do anything intentional. He was simply holding it, turning it in his fingers the way he turned everything, end over end, and he said something quietly, not a spell, just a word, a sound that was barely language, more like the expression of the particular quality of the afternoon, the September light and the smell of turned earth and the two girls nearby and the specific weight of the day and everything in it. The wand lit. Not a spell light. Not a color or a charm or a controlled burst of anything. The wood itself lit, warm, gold green, from the inside, like a lamp behind paper, and the light moved out from the wand and filled the courtyard, and it was neither hot nor cold but both, and it smelled of something that Daphne would later describe in her notes as rain on forest in summer, early morning, the specific light of something beginning. Harry looked at the wand in his hand. He didn't look surprised. He looked, as he looked when things confirmed what he already understood, quietly satisfied. That one, he said. Fleur made the sound she made when she was working very hard not to show how moved she was. Yes, she said. That one. But the light didn't stop. It kept moving, and it found Fleur first, washing over her silver hair and her pale skin and the gold thread quality of her Vela magic that Harry had described months ago on a bus to London, and the light recognized something in her and she gasped, short and sharp, and her own magic rose to meet it, gold and warm, and they wove together, his green gold and her pure gold, and it was beautiful in a way that made Daphne grip her quill. And then it reached her. She had 1 second of thinking she should document this, followed immediately by the complete inability to do anything of the sort, because the light hit her and the ice-blue architecture of her magic that she'd built and studied and refined with such careful precision simply, opened. Not broke. Opened. Like a window she hadn't known was shut. And through it came something she'd never allowed herself to examine directly, the thing underneath all the strategy and the notes and the precise handwriting and the 6 weeks of planning that had brought her to Privet Drive, the wanting. Clear and clean and entirely her own, not the bond, not the Vela pull, not the political positioning, just Daphne Greengrass, 8 years old, wanting this, wanting them, wanting the three-part thing to be what it was becoming without asking anyone's permission and without a contract and without a fallback position. The light held all three of them for a moment that was either very short or very long, and then it settled, drawing back not into the wand but into the space between them, ambient, present, the way the protection magic was now woven into the bond, not separate, just there. Harry lowered the wand. Daphne realized she'd sat down on the courtyard stones at some point, which was undignified and which she couldn't bring herself to care about. Fleur was standing with both hands pressed flat against her sternum, looking at Harry with an expression that had every single layer of her removed. Just Fleur, just this. Harry looked at both of them. His green eyes were lit, literally, the magic visible in them the way strong emotion makes eyes bright, and his face was the clearest Daphne had ever seen it. No watchfulness, no careful assessment, just present, here, this. Okay, he said, which was what he said when something was confirmed that he'd known for a while. So that's what that is. What? Daphne said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. The pulling, he said. What I felt when you opened the cupboard. What I felt when Fleur held my hand. He turned the wand end over end. I thought it was the bond. It is the bond, Fleur said. Yes, Harry said. But it's also just mine. He looked at them both. It's just mine. I'm not going to do anything complicated with it. I'm 7. But I want, he stopped, started again, the particular stop-start of someone being precisely honest about something they haven't said out loud before. I want you both to know that it's there. That it's real. That it's not the contract or the magic or the prophecy or any of the things people have been trying to attach to me for the past 2 months. He held their gaze, one and then the other. It's just me. The courtyard was entirely still, the September light falling clean and even, and Emmeline Vance, who had finished her ward work 20 minutes ago, was somewhere inside the manor having tea and not in this moment, which was as it should be. Daphne looked at the holly wand in Harry's hand. Looked at the space between the three of them where the light had settled and stayed. Looked at Harry, his cracked glasses finally replaced last week with ones that fit and weren't broken, his black hair as undirectable as ever, his green eyes that had been the first thing she'd seen in that cupboard and had never once looked at her with anything that needed something back. I know, she said. I know it's just you. She paused. That's why it matters. Fleur sat down on the courtyard stones beside Daphne. Not across from them, beside her, the three of them forming the triangle that they kept forming without deciding to, the shape that the bond made physical. When I followed the feeling, Fleur said, to the courtyard in general, on the port quay, I did not know where I was going. I only knew the direction. She looked at Harry. I think perhaps that is what love is, when it is real. You don't know where you're going. You only know the direction. Harry looked at the wand. Intention with permission, he said, and Fleur made the almost sound of surprised recognition, the specific sound of someone hearing their own words land somewhere they hadn't expected. Yes, she said. Exactly that. Daphne looked at her notes, sitting on the stone beside her, and did something she'd never done before, she closed them. Deliberately, consciously, closed them and set them aside and sat in the afternoon without documenting it. Some things were not for records. That evening, Cyrus Greengrass called a family meeting. He called it formally, which in Greengrass family terms meant he put his head into the library and said, "Library," half an hour, and then left, and everyone treated this as the summons it was. Apollon was included, which was now natural. She'd been in the manor for 2 weeks of the rotation and the formal division between Delacour's rooms and Greengrass's rooms had blurred, the way the boundaries of any two careful things blur when they spend enough time adjacent. They assembled at 6:30, Cyrus and Apollon in the armchairs, Daphne at the reading desk, Harry on the floor with his back against the bookshelves, Fleur on the window seat. The library held them with the ease of a room that has grown used to this particular configuration. Cyrus put a folder of parchment on the desk. He looked at it for a moment before speaking, which meant he'd been thinking about what he was about to say for longer than the afternoon. 3 things, he said. First, Harry's formal legal situation. He opened the folder. The custody arrangement as it stands is interim. The full legal resolution requires a permanent framework. I've been working with Apollon and with Gringotts on a proposal. He looked at Harry. What we're proposing is an emancipated co-guardianship, not standard guardianship, which assigns authority over the ward to the guardian, but a model that recognizes Harry's demonstrated capacity and gives him formal co-equal standing in decisions affecting his own life, with Apollon and I serving as supporters, not authorities. Harry looked at him. You're giving me the choice, he said. I'm recognizing that you already have it, Cyrus said. The paperwork is catching up to the reality. He looked at his hands briefly. It means you can refuse any arrangement. Any contract. Any placement. Legally, with teeth. He looked up. Including anything I might propose. The sentence landed with the weight of its own history. Daphne met her father's eyes and he held them, and the conversation they'd had over the contract was present in the room without being said. Second, Cyrus continued. Education. Harry will need formal magical training, properly structured, before Hogwarts. I've reached an agreement with Apollon about how we divide this. He glanced at Apollon, and with Dumbledore, who has agreed to contribute specific curriculum around defensive theory when Harry is ready for it. He paused. The arrangement assumes continued rotation between the manor and the Delacour family's properties. Paris in alternating months. Both families' resources available. Third, he said. He closed the folder. This is not a legal thing. This is a father thing. He looked at Harry again, and Daphne recognized the expression on his face with a sharpness that surprised her. It was the expression he turned on her when she'd done something that cost him pride to acknowledge having missed. I have spent the last 2 months thinking about you strategically, he said. About what your position means. What your bond means. What the alliance means. He paused. I have not spent enough time thinking about the fact that you are a 7-year-old child who spent 6 years in a cupboard and deserves someone who simply gives a damn about him as a person. Not a position. He looked at Harry. I intend to do better at that. The library was very quiet. Harry looked at Cyrus for a long moment. His face did the thing it did, the processing, the assessing, the weighing of genuine against performed, and what had arrived at this time was not the small almost smile or the wider one but something different, something that sat lower on his face, in the jaw and the eyes rather than the mouth, the expression of someone who has been offered something they didn't know they were waiting for. Okay, he said. I'd like that. Cyrus nodded once, the precise nod. Good, he said, and stood up and poured himself more tea, and the moment passed into the ordinary texture of the evening without ceremony. Apollon looked at Fleur across the room, and Fleur looked back at her mother, and something passed between them in French that Daphne suspected was long and important and was being conducted without words. Harry looked at Daphne. She looked back at him and raised an eyebrow, and he made the shape of the thing that had become a proper smile now, lived in and real, nothing tentative about it. After, when the adults had moved to the sitting room and the library had returned to the three of them, Harry stood up from the floor and went to the tall window at the library's end and looked out at the garden in the dark. Daphne knew this window. She'd found him here before, the night after the tea room, when he'd been trying to remember the sound of his mother's laugh. She came to stand beside him. Fleur came to stand on his other side, and they looked out at the dark garden together, the three of them in a row, and the bond was present between them like the warmth in a room after the fire's been going for hours, not something you generate, just something you've built together and that stays. Harry, Daphne said. Yeah. The choosing, she said. Not formal, not legal, not strategic. Just the word. What was said in the courtyard today? About it being yours. She looked at the garden. I want to say the same thing back. Not because the bond says so. Not because of any of the things the last 2 months have been about. She paused. Because you are one of the 2 best people I've ever met, and that matters more than every piece of parchment I've written this summer. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, one of 2. The other one is standing on your left, Daphne said. Fleur made a soft sound. He knew that, she said. I knew that, Harry confirmed. Daphne looked at the garden and felt the almost smile she'd been carrying around for 2 months, the one that kept threatening to become something larger, finally become it. Fleur, Harry said. You said love is knowing the direction without knowing the destination. He was still looking at the garden. I think the destination is this. Whatever this is right now. A pause. I think we keep building toward it. Fleur looked at him. In the dark, her silver hair was pale as starlight and her expression was the unarmored one, the real one, the crooked one that wasn't performed for anyone. Then we build, she said. Together, Daphne said. Together, Harry agreed. Outside, the September garden was dark and quiet and full of the particular substance of late summer becoming autumn, that moment of turning when one thing is not yet gone and the next has not yet fully arrived, and it was exactly the right moment for this, for standing at a window in a library that had become more home than any of them had quite meant it to and saying true things. Harry reached up and touched the window glass with 2 fingers, lightly, the gesture she'd seen him make before, not quite reaching and not quite not. It's good, he said. All of it. Even the complicated parts. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass, and his reflection looked back at him, a 7-year-old with green eyes and black hair and a wand in his pocket that had lit the afternoon gold green, wearing clothes that fit him and standing between 2 people who had knocked on a door they had no business knocking on and refused to leave. I didn't think it got to be this good. The window held the 3 of them in reflection for a moment, silver and ice blue and green gold, the 3 colors of their magic layered in the glass, and then a cloud moved somewhere and the stars came out over the Wiltshire garden and the reflections dissolved into the dark. Daphne thought about Marchbanks in the Wisengamot chamber, saying take care of it, and understood for the first time what she'd actually meant. Not the bond as an ancient magical phenomenon with legal precedent and strategic implications. Not the political leverage of a 3-fold anchor in a world that was going to need it in 10 years. Just this, 3 children at a window, choosing each other, and the particular quality of care that choosing required. She intended to take care of it. She would take notes. She would read everything. She would build the legal and strategic architecture that the world would require of them, and she would do it with the precision her father had taught her and the warmth she'd found in a summer that had started with a broken portkey and a French girl on a Muggle pavement. Fleur would feel the direction. She would follow the things that were true before logic caught up, and she would be right, and she would be occasionally impossible, and she would bring better cocoa than anyone had a right to, and she would teach Harry that some magic was intention with permission, and she would stand next to people in small dark rooms and make the rooms less dark by being in them. And Harry would be Harry, which meant he would set things on fire while reading about starlings, and he would tell you the color of your magic without understanding that he shouldn't know how, and he would look at the most powerful wizard in Britain across a tea-room table and say, "Tell me what you're keeping back," and he would be afraid of nothing because he had been through the worst kind of alone and come out the other side of it into this, and he understood, in his bones, the difference between what was worth being afraid of and what wasn't. And Voldemort would come back. And there would be harder years than this. And Lucius Malfoy's letters would not be the last such letter. And the Wisengamot would have more opinions about the 3 of them, and Dumbledore would keep some things back for a while yet, and the world was going to ask enormous things of all of them. But that was later. That was years from now, and years were time, and time was what they had. Right now there was a window and a garden and 3 children, and the bond that had made all of it inevitable from the moment Daphne knocked on a door in Surrey and Fleur arrived at the same door at the same time for entirely different reasons, and the thing between them that was already, at 7 and 8 and 9 years old, the most concentrated expression of magical will that the natural world produced. "Come on," Harry said, turning from the window. Apollon said there was more of that cocoa. "I told you," Fleur said, following him. "You were right," Harry said. "I am frequently right," Fleur said. "You are frequently right about things that aren't on paper," Daphne said, picking up her notes from the reading desk. Not closing them this time. Just carrying them. I am frequently right about things that are. And I am right about Coco, Harry said. Which is more important than both. They left the library together, their footsteps overlapping in that synchronized rhythm that had arrived without being chosen, and the library settled behind them into the quiet of a room that had held something important and was content with that, and the manor held them all in its old stone walls, and outside the September stars did their patient ancient thing over the Wiltshire countryside. And somewhere under the stairs of Number 4 Privet Drive, there was an empty cupboard with 2 locks and a bolt. And it would stay empty.